Imagine, if you will, a vast open field in central France. The air is crisp with the chill of late November, each breath pluming into a small, white cloud before vanishing. The year is 1095. A sea of people, thousands upon thousands, huddles together, their bodies a tapestry of damp wool, worn leather, and the occasional glint of chainmail under a lord's heavy cloak. They are bishops in fine robes, powerful dukes with stern faces, landless knights with hungry eyes, and humble peasants who have walked for days, drawn by a rumor of something momentous. The sky above is a flat, unforgiving gray, and the ground beneath their feet is cold and muddy. A wooden platform has been erected, and upon it stands a man, not imposing in stature, but radiating an authority that silences the restless murmur of the crowd. He is Pope Urban II. He has just concluded a long church council in the nearby town of Clermont, dealing with matters of ecclesiastical law and clerical discipline, the usual dry business of the medieval church. But now he has come outside into the raw air to speak to the masses. He is about to deliver a sermon that will not just echo through the field, but will thunder across a continent, shake the foundations of empires, and unleash a current of faith, ambition, and violence that will change the world forever. The flickering torchlight catches the gold thread in his vestments as he raises a hand, and a profound silence falls over the meadow. For a moment, the only sounds are the rustle of wind in the bare trees and the distant cawing of a crow. What words could a single man say to move so many to leave their homes, their families, everything they have ever known, to undertake a journey of thousands of miles into lands they knew only from scripture and myth? Did you know this was the day a holy war was born from a single, electrifying speech? The man, born Odo de Lagery, was a French nobleman before he was a pope, a man who understood the minds of the warriors and aristocrats who stood before him. He knew their world was one of perpetual, grinding conflict. Knights, with little to do but fight, constantly warred against each other for scraps of land and honor. Violence was not an event. It was the very atmosphere they breathed. The church had tried for decades to contain it, with movements called the Peace of God and the Truce of God, essentially telling these heavily armed professionals they couldn't fight on Sundays or attack peasants. It was, to put it mildly, a suggestion that was only partially successful. Urban, a canny political operator as well as a man of faith, looked out at this sea of restless energy and saw not a problem, but a solution. His gaze swept over the powerful counts, the landless second and third sons with no inheritance to look forward to but a sword, and the deeply pious common folk who believed the world was steeped in sin and nearing its end. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly helps keep these journeys into the past going. He began to speak, his voice rising with carefully crafted passion. We don't have a word-for-word transcript of what he said. What we have are 5 different accounts written by chroniclers years later, each with their own spin, but they all agree on the core message. He spoke of their brethren in the East, the Christians of the Byzantine Empire, suffering under the yoke of the Seljuk Turks. He painted vivid, horrifying pictures, likely exaggerated for effect, of Christian pilgrims being tortured, holy sites being desecrated. He described the sacred city of Jerusalem, the center of the Christian universe, the place where Christ had walked and died and been resurrected, as being in the hands of non-believers. This was a deep, spiritual wound for everyone listening. Then came the masterstroke. He turned his attention back to the crowd, to the knights and lords fidgeting in the cold. He called them out, not just for their sins, but for their wasted potential. Why, he asked, do you fight your brothers? Why do you exhaust yourselves in pointless private wars? Here, he offered, was a new war, a righteous war. Stop fighting each other, he implored, and turn your swords against the enemies of God. He presented an opportunity for them to do the one thing they were good at, fighting, but in service of the highest possible cause. It was a brilliant reframing of their entire existence. Their violent nature wasn't a sin to be suppressed. It was a tool to be sanctified. And then, the ultimate incentive. For those who took up this cause, who journeyed to liberate the Holy Land, he offered something unprecedented, a plenary indulgence. All the sins of those who went on this armed pilgrimage, who took the cross, would be immediately forgiven. It was a spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card. For people who lived in daily fear of eternal damnation, this was an offer of almost unimaginable power. The journey would be arduous, dangerous, and likely fatal, but the reward was a guaranteed place in heaven. Historians still argue whether Urban's primary motive was the genuine liberation of Jerusalem, a strategic move to aid the Byzantine Empire and perhaps heal the great schism between the Eastern and Western churches, or a cynical ploy to export Europe's violence and cement his own papal authority over kings and emperors. Perhaps it was all three. Whatever his intent, the effect was electric. As his speech reached its crescendo, a chant began to ripple through the crowd, growing from a murmur to a roar that shook the cold French air. Deus vult, Deus vult. God wills it. Priests began circulating, cutting strips of cloth into the shape of a cross for men to sew onto their tunics, a visible sign of the vow they had just taken. The Pope had perhaps hoped to raise a few hundred, maybe a few thousand, well-trained knights for a disciplined military expedition. He had instead lit a wildfire that would consume the continent. He had spoken to the lords, but the peasants had heard him too. The message spread from the field at Clermont via priests and preachers, morphing and simplifying as it went. It was a call to arms that promised adventure, riches, land, and above all, salvation. It was an idea so powerful, so perfectly timed, that it would soon spiral far beyond anyone's control, drawing in not just the princes he had intended, but a vast, chaotic, and tragically unprepared wave of humanity. Why not let us know where you're listening from and what time it is there? It's always a quiet joy to see how far these stories travel. The Great Crusade had been called, but the first to answer would not be the ones anyone expected. Pope Urban's message, intended for the ears of disciplined knights and powerful lords, had escaped the confines of the meadow at Clermont and taken on a wild, unpredictable life of its own. It was carried across France and into the Rhineland, not just by official church messengers, but by a host of wandering, charismatic preachers who amplified and simplified its core promise. Go east, fight for God, and wash your soul clean. The most effective and famous of these was a man from Amio, a diminutive figure with a fiery gaze and a powerful voice known to history as Peter the Hermit. He was a master of populist rhetoric, a man who traveled from village to village, often barefoot and riding a simple donkey, captivating vast crowds of common folk with his passionate sermons. He spoke not of strategy or logistics, but of visions and divine imperatives, painting a picture of a holy mission in which faith alone was the only weapon required. The response from the peasantry was overwhelming and immediate. For them, life was a cycle of backbreaking labor, famine, and disease, lived under the heel of a local lord. The idea of a pilgrimage to the earthly Jerusalem was a release, a chance to escape a grim reality and participate directly in a great cosmic drama. They believed with a fervent and simple faith that they were God's chosen instruments and that He would provide for them, parting seas and smiting their enemies as He had for the Israelites of old. And so, long before the great dukes and counts had finished polishing their armor and mustering their vassals, a vast, spontaneous, and utterly disorganized migration began. This was not an army. It was a human tide, a loose collection of columns comprising tens of thousands of men, women, and even whole families who sold their meager possessions, packed their belongings onto rickety carts, and set off under the spiritual leadership of Peter the Hermit and a minor knight named Walter Sans Avoir, whose name aptly translates to Walter without property. Historians still argue about the exact numbers, with estimates ranging from 60,000 to over 100,000, but all agree that it was a massive and unprecedented movement of people. This first wave, known as the People's Crusade or the Peasants' Crusade, was a disaster before it even left the heart of Christendom. As some of these bands moved through the Rhineland in the spring of 1096, a dark and violent interpretation of the crusading message took hold. Goaded by radical preachers, they decided that before marching thousands of miles to fight the enemies of Christ in the East, they should first deal with the infidels in their midst. This led to a series of horrific pogroms against the Jewish communities in cities like Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. These communities had lived peacefully in the region for centuries. They were offered the choice of forced conversion or death. Thousands were massacred in a brutal wave of anti-Semitic violence that was a stain on the entire crusading enterprise, a horrifying perversion of the Pope's original intent. Those who continued east were less a disciplined army and more a sprawling, hungry mob. Their journey through Hungary and the Balkans was fraught with conflict. Having set off with few supplies, they relied on foraging, which quickly devolved into pillaging. The local populations, who were fellow Christians, responded with force, and the Crusaders found themselves fighting pitched battles against the very people they were supposed to be passing through peacefully. By the time the ragged, starving survivors of this chaotic march reached the gates of Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios the Bersator Komnenos was appalled. He had sent a request to the Pope for a contingent of elite, professional mercenaries. Instead, his capital was now besieged by a vast, unruly, and largely unarmed horde that was consuming all the resources of the countryside. He provided them with food and supplies, but his main goal was to get them out of his territory as quickly as possible ferrying them across the Bosphorus Strait into Asia Minor with a mixture of relief and grim foreboding. It was the medieval equivalent of calling for a plumber and having 1,000 unruly festival goers show up on your lawn instead. Once in Turkish-controlled lands, their faith proved to be no match for the realities of war. The Crusaders, now without the restraining hand of the Byzantine authorities, immediately began raiding the local villages, provoking the wrath of the local Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan. Peter the Hermit, perhaps sensing disaster, had returned to Constantinople to plead for more supplies, and in his absence, the host fractured. A band of French crusaders, acting on their own, captured a Turkish fort called Zeragordos, but were soon surrounded. The Turks cut off their water supply, and after 8 days of agonizing thirst, the survivors were forced to surrender and were either killed or sold into slavery. Hearing of this, the main body of the crusade, some 20,000 strong, was goaded into seeking revenge. Against the advice of Walter Sans Avoir and other wiser heads, they marched out of their camp at Civito and straight into a perfectly laid Turkish trap. The Seljuk army was waiting for them in ambush. The battle was a slaughter. The Turkish horse archers rained arrows down on the terrified, unarmored peasants. The undisciplined mob broke and fled, and they were cut down as they ran. The great people's crusade was annihilated. Walter Sans Avoir was among the thousands killed. A few survivors managed to escape back to the coast, where they were rescued by the Byzantines. Peter the Hermit's grand vision had ended in a field of bones, a tragic and bloody overture to the main event, a grim lesson that faith without discipline and zeal without strategy was simply a recipe for martyrdom. The stage was now clear for the real army. While the bones of Peter the Hermit's followers were still bleaching under the Anatolian sun, the army that Pope Urban had actually envisioned was finally beginning to move. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1096, a very different kind of force was mustering across Western Europe. This was not a spontaneous flood of popular piety, but the deliberate, calculated, and massively expensive mobilization of the great feudal lords of Christendom. This was the Prince's Crusade, and it was the most formidable military force the West had ever assembled. Unlike a modern army, it was not a single, unified body under a central command. Instead, it was a collection of 4 main contingents, each a vast private army loyal to its own great lord, each marching under its own banners, and each deeply suspicious of the others. It was less a national effort and more an all-star team of rivals who had agreed to play for the same side, for now. From the lands of Lorraine, on the border of France and the German Empire, came the army of Godfrey of Bouillon, the Duke of Lower Lorraine. Godfrey was a figure of quiet and intense piety, respected by all as a brave and just man. He embodied the ideal of the Crusade more purely than perhaps any other leader. So committed was he to the cause that he sold or mortgaged everything he owned, including his magnificent castle at Bouillon, to finance his expedition. He was accompanied by his 2 brothers, the pragmatic and ambitious Baldwin of Boulogne and Eustace, the Count of Boulogne. Theirs was a disciplined and formidable force, moving overland with a clear sense of purpose. From the south of France marched the largest and wealthiest contingent, led by the formidable Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse. Raymond was the elder statesman of the Crusade, a veteran of the wars against the Moors in Spain, and a man of immense power and deep, if somewhat ostentatious, piety. He was the first great prince to take the cross and saw himself as the natural secular leader of the entire enterprise. He was also famously stubborn and avaricious. To show his commitment, he swore an oath never to return home, and he brought his wife and his entire household with him. Traveling with Raymond's army was the man who was, in theory, the true leader of the expedition, Outremer, the Bishop of Le Puy. As the official papal legate, Outremer was the Pope's man on the ground, tasked with the near impossible job of keeping the proud and quarrelsome princes focused on their spiritual goal and preventing them from tearing each other apart over petty jealousies. Another great force came from the Normans of southern Italy, led by a man whose name was already a legend and a terror to the Byzantines, Bohemond of Taranto. Tall, handsome, and a military genius, Bohemond was the son of Robert Guiscard, the Norman adventurer who had conquered half of Italy and had spent years at war with the Byzantine Empire. Bohemond was the ultimate opportunist. While he was likely a man of genuine faith, he saw in the Crusade a golden opportunity to use his military skills to carve out a new kingdom for himself in the East. He was the brilliant, dangerous wild card of the group. With him was his nephew Tancred, a young knight who would become the very model of chivalric heroism for later generations. Finally, from northern France and Flanders came a powerful group led by three great princes: Robert Curthose, the easygoing but often ineffectual Duke of Normandy, and eldest son of William the Conqueror; the immensely wealthy but notoriously indecisive Stephen, Count of Blois, whose frequent letters home to his wife provide one of our most vivid accounts of the Crusade; and Robert II, the Count of Flanders, a brave and respected warrior. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for these men was sincere faith or a more worldly desire for land, glory, and plunder. The truth is that for most, it was likely an inseparable tangle of all these things. They were complex men of a complex age, motivated by a mix of piety and personal ambition that seems contradictory to the modern mind, but was perfectly natural to them. Their armies were a breathtaking sight, a river of steel and horseflesh flowing eastward. This was the cutting edge of medieval military power. Thousands of knights, encased in 70 pounds of chainmail, rode upon massive war horses called destriers, bred for size and strength. Each knight was the center of his own small unit, a lance, which might include squires and mounted sergeants. They were supported by tens of thousands of trained infantry, spearmen to form a defensive wall against cavalry, and archers to provide covering fire. And trailing behind them was a city on the move, a vast baggage train of ox carts laden with weapons, armor, food, and wine, along with blacksmiths to shoe the horses, priests to hear confession, merchants looking to make a profit, and thousands of non-combatant pilgrims and camp followers. It was a logistical undertaking of staggering complexity, and the fact that it was attempted at all is a testament to the organizational power of the feudal system. The plan, such as it was for these four great armies to travel by different routes and rendezvous outside the walls of the greatest Christian city in the world, Constantinople, before plunging into enemy territory. The city and its emperor awaited their arrival with a deep sense of dread as the great armies of the princes began to arrive, one by one, at the gates of Constantinople in the winter of 1096 and the spring of 1097. They were met with a sight that must have seemed like a vision from another world. For the rough-hewn lords of Western Europe, whose grandest castles were often little more than drafty stone towers, Constantinople was a city of almost unimaginable splendor and sophistication. It was a metropolis of 1,000,000 souls, with paved streets, towering basilicas like the Hagia Sophia, magnificent palaces, and a level of wealth and ancient learning that made their own kingdoms seem rustic and primitive by comparison. But the wonder was mixed with a deep and mutual suspicion. To the Crusaders, or Franks, as the Byzantines called all Westerners, the locals were Greeks, seen as effeminate, treacherous, and doctrinally suspect since the Great Schism that had split the church decades earlier. To the Byzantines, the Crusaders were barbarians, illiterate, violent, and unpredictable, a dangerous force that had to be carefully managed. At the center of this delicate political dance was the Emperor Alexios III Komnenos. He was a brilliant and cunning diplomat who found himself in an exceedingly difficult position. Remember that he had asked the Pope for a few regiments of elite Western knights to help him reclaim his lost lands in Anatolia. What he got was the entire military might of Western Europe, led by ambitious princes who were his political equals and, in the case of Bohemond of Taranto, his sworn mortal enemies. Alexios's goals were simple. First, to keep these massive, heavily armed hosts from running riot and sacking his capital, and second, to extract a promise from their leaders. He demanded that each of the princes swear an oath of fealty to him, promising that any former Byzantine city they reconquered from the Turks would be returned to his imperial authority. It was his price for providing the food, supplies, and logistical support they so desperately needed. This demand led to a series of tense and theatrical negotiations in the imperial palace. The Western lords, who saw themselves as beholden to no one but God, bristled at the idea of becoming vassals to a Greek emperor. Hugh of Vermandois, arriving first and rather full of his own importance, agreed easily enough. Godfrey of Bouillon was more reluctant, holding out for a time before the emperor cut off his army's food supplies, a classic negotiating tactic that quickly brought him to the table. Bohemond, the emperor's old foe, ironically swore the oath with the most apparent enthusiasm, calculating that it was the quickest way to win the emperor's favor and position himself for future gains. The most difficult was Raymond of Toulouse, who, seeing himself as the senior partner in the enterprise, stubbornly refused to swear the full oath, offering only a modified promise not to harm the emperor. The standoff grew so tense that Godfrey and Bohemond had to physically restrain Raymond's men from drawing their swords in the imperial court. Historians still argue about the precise nature of these oaths and whether the princes ever truly intended to honor them, but one by one, Alexios got the promises he needed. With the diplomacy concluded, he wasted no time in ferrying the great armies, division by division, across the Bosphorus Strait and onto Asian soil. He was, no doubt, profoundly relieved to have them out of his capital. Their first target was the city of Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan. It was a formidable fortress, surrounded by massive walls and protected on one side by a large lake. Here, for the first time, the combined Crusader armies worked together alongside a Byzantine contingent. They laid siege to the city for over a month. As their siege engines began to batter the walls, the city's garrison, realizing they were doomed, entered into secret negotiations with the Byzantines. One morning in June of 1097, the Crusaders awoke to find not their own banners, but the imperial dragon standard of the emperor flying from the city's towers. Alexios had accepted the city's surrender and moved his own troops in during the night. While it was a brilliant strategic move, it left the Crusader rank and file furious. They had been denied their chance to sack the city and claim its riches, which they saw as their rightful reward. The incident planted a deep seed of mistrust, confirming their worst suspicions about the treacherous Greeks. After Nicaea, the army marched on, but the vast host split into two columns to make foraging for food and water easier in the arid landscape. This nearly proved to be a fatal mistake. On the 1st of July, the vanguard column, commanded by Bohemond, was ambushed by the main Turkish army of Kilij Arslan near Dorylaeum. The Crusaders were caught completely by surprise. The Turkish horse archers, famed for their lightning-fast tactics, swarmed around the smaller Crusader force, showering them with arrows. Bohemond's men were surrounded and on the verge of annihilation. Thinking fast, the Norman leader ordered his knights to dismount and form a tight defensive circle with the vulnerable non-combatants in the center. For 5 agonizing hours, they held their ground under the blistering sun, a small island of defiance in a sea of Turkish cavalry. Just as their line was beginning to break, the banners of the Second Crusader army appeared on the horizon. Godfrey and Raymond, hearing the sounds of battle, had force-marched their men to the rescue. Their heavy cavalry crashed into the Turkish flank, and the tide of the battle turned in an instant. The surprised Turks were routed, and the victory was total. Dorylaeum was a crucial success. It proved that the Crusaders could defeat the Turks in open battle, and it opened the road across the vast, hostile plateau of Anatolia. Their long, grueling march toward Syria and their next great obstacle could now begin. After the victory at Dorylaeum, the path through the heart of Anatolia was open, but it was a path of immense suffering. The great Crusader army embarked on a grueling 3-month march across a sun-scorched, desolate landscape. The Turkish forces, while no longer offering open battle, shadowed them, employing scorched earth tactics, poisoning wells, and burning crops to deny the invaders any sustenance. Food and water became dangerously scarce. The heavily armored knights and their massive war horses, bred for the cool, damp climates of northern Europe, suffered terribly under the relentless sun. Men died of thirst, and horses collapsed by the hundreds, their carcasses left to rot on the side of the road. By the time the ragged, emaciated survivors of this ordeal finally descended from the mountains and into the fertile plains of northern Syria in October of 1097, they were a hard-bitten, exhausted, but grimly determined force, and before them lay their next great objective, the legendary city of Antioch. Antioch was not just another fortress. It was a city of immense strategic and symbolic importance. In the ancient world, it had been one of the great capitals of the Roman Empire, and for Christians, it was a holy city, second only to Jerusalem and Rome in prestige. It was here, according to the book of Acts, that the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. But it was also a formidable military obstacle. The city was protected by a circuit of walls, nearly 12 miles long, studded with over 400 towers, built by the Roman Emperor Justinian 5 centuries earlier. With the Orontes River flowing along its western edge and the towering peak of Mount Silpius anchoring its citadel to the south, Antioch was widely considered to be impregnable. The Crusader leaders, arriving late in the campaigning season, made the bold decision to lay siege to the city immediately. It was a monumental undertaking for which they were ill prepared. The city was so vast that their army was not large enough to encircle it completely, meaning the defenders could still bring in supplies and reinforcements with relative ease. As the siege began, the Crusaders settled in for the winter, and their situation quickly became desperate. The surrounding countryside was soon stripped bare of all food. A terrible famine gripped the camp. The price of a loaf of bread soared to astronomical levels, and men were reduced to eating their own horses, then dogs, rats, and even boiled leather. Disease followed hunger, and the Crusader camp became a vast open-air hospital, with men dying in their thousands. Morale plummeted, desertions became common. Even Peter the Hermit, the charismatic preacher of the People's Crusade, tried to flee in the night, only to be caught by Tancred and brought back in shame. Most devastatingly, Stephen of Blois, one of the wealthiest princes, lost his nerve, and convinced that the enterprise was doomed, he took his entire army and headed for home, a betrayal that would have lasting consequences. As the siege dragged on for 8 miserable months, the Crusaders managed to beat back 2 Turkish relief armies, but they were no closer to taking the city itself. The deadlock was finally broken, not by force, but by treachery. The ever-pragmatic Bohemond, the Norman leader, had been cultivating contacts within the city's large Armenian Christian population. He found his man in an Armenian armor maker named Fairuz, a commander of one of the watchtowers who held a grudge against the city's Turkish governor, Yagi Siyan. For a price, Fairuz agreed to betray his post. Bohemond, ever the opportunist, then made his move. He gathered the other Crusader princes and informed them he had a way into the city, but he would only reveal it if they all agreed that he, and he alone, would be the Prince of Antioch should it fall. The other leaders, particularly his great rival Raymond of Toulouse, were furious, but with their army on the verge of collapse, they had little choice but to agree. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, Fairuz lowered a rope from his tower, and a small party of Bohemond's knights scaled the ancient walls. They quickly overpowered the guards, opened a nearby gate, and the Crusader army, which had been waiting in silence outside, poured into the sleeping city. What followed was a night of horrific slaughter, as the frustrated and starving Crusaders vented their months of pent-up rage on the city's inhabitants. But their triumph was to be terrifyingly short-lived. A mere 3 days after they had taken the city, a colossal Turkish relief army, led by the powerful Atabeg of Mosul, Kerboga, arrived and surrounded Antioch. The besiegers had become the besieged, Trapped inside a city whose food supplies they had already consumed, with Kerboga's massive army outside, their situation was now utterly, completely hopeless. It was in this moment of absolute despair that a miracle occurred. A poor, uneducated peasant from Provence in Raymond's contingent, a man named Peter Bartholomew, came forward claiming to have had a series of visions of Saint Andrew. The saint, he said, had revealed to him the location of the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross, which was buried beneath the floor of the city's cathedral of St. Peter. Desperate for any sign of hope, the leaders agreed to let him dig. After a day of fruitless labor, Peter Bartholomew himself jumped into the pit and emerged moments later, clutching a piece of old iron. Historians still argue whether the discovery was a genuine miracle, a fortunate coincidence, or a pious fraud orchestrated to raise morale. Whatever its origin, the effect of the discovery of the Holy Lance on the starving, terrified army was immediate and profound. It was a sign from God. They were not doomed. They were destined for victory. Their morale was transformed from black despair to a state of religious ecstasy. The starving army of Christ, now armed with a holy relic, prepared to do the impossible, to march out and give battle to Kerboga's vast, well-fed host. On the morning of June 28, 1098, the gates of Antioch swung open, and a ghost of an army marched out to face a host that outnumbered them by at least 3-1. The Crusaders were gaunt and hollow-eyed from starvation, their armor battered, their horses little more than skeletons. But in their eyes was the wild, unshakable conviction of men who believed they were marching under the direct protection of God. At their head, a priest carried their newfound treasure, the Holy Lance, held aloft like a banner. They advanced in disciplined columns, a testament to the military instincts of their leaders, Bohemond and Godfrey. The Turkish commander, Kerboga, was so confident of victory that he allowed them to form up on the plain unmolested, planning to annihilate them in a single, decisive stroke. It was a fatal miscalculation. He had failed to account for two things: the fanatical morale of the Crusaders and the deep internal divisions within his own army. Kerboga was an arrogant and unpopular commander, and the various powerful emirs who had brought their own troops to the siege were deeply resentful of his authority. As the starving Crusaders launched a desperate, seemingly suicidal charge, their war cries echoing across the plain, the fragile Turkish coalition shattered. Several of Kerboga's key subordinates, having no desire to see their powerful rival win such a glorious victory, simply pulled their troops out of the battle line and marched away. Panic and confusion ripped through the remaining Turkish ranks. The army collapsed into a rout, and the Crusaders, against all possible odds, won a total and astonishing victory. For them, it was proof positive. God was on their side. The miraculous victory at Antioch, however, was followed by a long and dispiriting anticlimax. The path to Jerusalem was now clear, but the crusade ground to a halt, bogged down by the earthly ambitions of its leaders. Bohemond, as per his agreement, claimed the city of Antioch and all its surrounding territory for himself, establishing the second Crusader state. He flatly refused to honor his oath to return the city to the Byzantine emperor, a decision that would permanently poison relations with Constantinople. Raymond of Toulouse, his bitter rival, was enraged, believing he had been cheated out of the prize. The great lords, who had maintained a fragile unity in the face of a common enemy, now fell to bitter squabbling over the spoils of their victory. For 7 months, the main army remained camped in and around Antioch. A deadly epidemic, likely typhus, swept through their ranks in the summer heat, claiming thousands of lives, including that of the one man who might have been able to heal the rift, the papal legate, Adhemar of Le Puy. His death left the crusade without a spiritual leader, and the princes without a referee. By the end of 1098, the patience of the common soldiers and knights had worn out. They had not endured 3 years of unimaginable hardship to watch their leaders bicker over a Syrian city. They were pilgrims, and their vow was to liberate the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. A protest movement began to swell from the ranks. They threatened to tear down the walls of a town Raymond had captured, and some even began to talk of electing their own leader to finish the journey. This popular pressure finally shamed the princes into action. In January of 1099, Raymond, finally abandoning his claims in the north, led a contingent of the army south, barefoot in the manner of a true pilgrim. Godfrey, Tancred, and Robert of Flanders soon followed. Bohemond remained behind, the newly minted Prince of Antioch. The long-delayed march to Jerusalem had at last begun. The journey down the coast was surprisingly easy. The local Muslim emirs, having heard of the Crusaders' ferocity at Antioch, chose not to fight. Instead, they offered tribute, supplies, and safe passage, eager to see the Frankish army move through their lands and become someone else's problem. In early June of 1099, the Crusaders, now numbering only around 12,000 knights and infantry, finally reached the hills outside their sacred destination. They climbed a rise, and there, shimmering in the heat of the Judean summer, were the walls and towers of Jerusalem. The moment was one of profound, overwhelming emotion. After 3 years and 2,000 miles of battle, starvation, and disease, they had arrived. Hardened warriors wept openly, men fell to their knees in prayer, and a great hymn of thanksgiving rose from the ranks. But the city was powerfully defended by a strong garrison of Fatimid troops from Egypt, who had recently recaptured it from the Seljuks. The Crusaders' initial, unsupported assault failed, and they settled in for a siege, suffering terribly from a lack of food, and most critically, water. The turning point came with the fortuitous arrival of a flotilla of Genoese ships at the port of Jaffa, carrying skilled engineers, and most importantly, wood, a commodity almost non-existent in the barren Judean hills. With these resources, the Crusaders built 2 massive wheeled siege towers. On the night of July 13th, the final coordinated assault began. After a full day of brutal, desperate fighting, on the afternoon of July 15th, 1099, men from Godfrey of Bouillon's tower managed to gain a foothold on the northern wall. The gates were opened, and the Crusaders poured into the holy city. What followed was one of the most notorious massacres of the Middle Ages. For 2 days, the victorious Crusaders, in a state of religious frenzy and bloodlust, slaughtered the city's inhabitants. The mainstream historical fact, recorded by both horrified Muslim chroniclers and triumphant Christian ones, is that they killed indiscriminately men, women, and the city's entire Jewish population, who had taken refuge in their main synagogue, which the Crusaders then set on fire. One eyewitness, Raymond of Aguilers, wrote with chilling satisfaction that the blood in the streets was ankle deep. Having purged the holy city in a tide of violence, the knights, their armor still dripping with blood, walked to the church of the Holy Sepulchre, fell to their knees, and wept tears of pious joy. Their terrible holy work was done. In the immediate aftermath of the conquest of Jerusalem, the Crusaders, having washed the blood from their hands, faced a new and unfamiliar challenge: governance. The city was theirs, but it was an empty, echoing prize, its streets silent save for the footsteps of the conquerors. Their first task was to choose a ruler for the new state they had just carved out of the heart of the Levant. The great princes gathered in council, and the obvious candidate was the man who had led the largest and wealthiest army, Raymond of Toulouse. But Raymond's ambition and his prickly, arrogant nature had won him few friends among the other leaders. When they offered him the crown, he refused it, declaring with a grand show of piety that he would not wear a crown of gold in the city where his Savior had worn a crown of thorns. It was a noble sentiment, but historians suspect it was also a calculated political move. Knowing his support was weak, he likely hoped the others would insist, begging him to take the throne. The gamble failed. The electors took him at his word and promptly moved on. The crown was then offered to the universally respected Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey, in a display of what seems to have been genuine humility, also refused the title of king. He accepted the leadership, but took the more modest title of Advocatus Sancti Sepulchrae, the advocate or defender of the Holy Sepulchre. This decision cemented his reputation as a selfless and pious hero, the ideal Christian warrior. But his new kingdom, which would soon be known as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, was born into a state of extreme peril. The Fatimid rulers of Egypt, who had controlled Jerusalem before the Crusade, were not about to let it go. Within a month of the city's capture, a massive Egyptian army, much larger than the entire Crusader force, marched up the coast to reclaim their prize. Godfrey, proving he was as capable a commander as he was a pious man, gathered his forces and marched out to meet them. On August 12, 1099, in the coastal plain near the fortress of Ascalon, the Crusaders launched a surprise dawn attack on the disorganized and overconfident Egyptian camp. The battle was a rout, a stunning and decisive victory that scattered the Egyptian army and secured the new kingdom from immediate annihilation. The Battle of Ascalon was the final, triumphant military act of the First Crusade, and for most of the Crusaders, it was the end of their journey. With Jerusalem and the Holy Sepulchre liberated, and this final victory won, the vast majority of the surviving princes, knights, and soldiers now believed their holy vow had been fulfilled. A great wave of homesickness swept through the army. They had been away for more than 3 years, and they were eager to return to their lands and families in Europe, laden with relics and glory. Great leaders like Robert of Normandy and Robert of Flanders packed their banners and sailed for home. This mass exodus left Godfrey in a terrifyingly vulnerable position. He was the ruler of a new kingdom, but it was a kingdom almost entirely without an army. Chroniclers report that he was left with as few as 300 knights and perhaps 2,000 infantry to defend not just the vast and difficult to garrison city of Jerusalem, but the entire territory. They had built a magnificent house, but had left only a handful of guards to protect it. And so began the long, difficult, and fascinating experiment of Outremer, the land beyond the sea, as the French-speaking Crusaders called their new home. It was a unique society, a transplant of European feudalism into the complex and ancient cultural landscape of the Middle East. The new kingdom was organized along the same lines as the societies they had left behind. Godfrey and his brother Baldwin, who would take the title of king after Godfrey's death a year later, granted fiefs, parcels of land, to his most important followers, who in return pledged him their military service. This system of law and land tenure would eventually be codified in a famous collection of legal texts known as the Assizes of Jerusalem, one of the most detailed expressions of feudal law ever written. The Franks, as the Europeans were collectively known, were a tiny ruling class, a military and land-owning aristocracy presiding over a vastly larger and more diverse native population. Their new subjects included local Christians of many different sects, Syriac, Armenian, and Greek Orthodox, as well as a significant population of Muslims and Jews who were now second-class citizens in their own land. Over time, this ruling elite began to adapt. While they never abandoned their core European identity, they adopted elements of the local culture out of sheer necessity. They began to eat local foods, wear lighter, more breathable fabrics suited to the hot climate, and build homes with courtyards and thick stone walls to keep them cool. They even, much to the surprise of visitors from Europe, began to appreciate the local custom of frequent bathing. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was the heart of Outremer, but it was not alone. The other leaders of the Crusade had established their own territories to the north. Bohemon's Principality of Antioch, Baldwin's County of Edessa, and soon after, the County of Tripoli, which was carved out by the descendants of the ever-persistent Raymond of Toulouse. Together, these four Crusader states formed a long, thin, and precarious Christian-ruled territory clinging to the Mediterranean coast. It was a frontier society defined by a state of perpetual warfare. Every town was a fortress, every lord a soldier, and every day lived under the shadow of a potential raid or invasion. Their greatest weakness remained a chronic shortage of manpower, a problem that made every road in the kingdom a dangerous place, especially for the steady stream of unarmed pilgrims now flocking to see the liberated holy sites. A new kind of defender was desperately needed. The new kingdom of Jerusalem, though victorious in its first great battle at Ascalon, was a state born with a critical, congenital weakness, a chronic lack of manpower. While the great lords of Europe could, with immense effort, raise a vast army for a single crusade, they could not provide a permanent standing army to defend the territories won. This problem was felt most acutely on the kingdom's roads. For the entire enterprise of Outremer to remain viable, it depended on a steady flow of pilgrims from the west, who brought with them much-needed money and a constant replenishment of the Frankish population. The main point of entry was the port of Jaffa, but the 40-mile journey from there up to Jerusalem was a perilous gauntlet. The road wound through rocky hills and narrow passes that were the natural habitat of bandits, discharged soldiers from defeated armies, and local tribes who viewed the defenseless pilgrim caravans as a welcome source of income. The small royal army could do little more than send out occasional patrols, which were easily avoided by the raiders, who would simply melt back into the hills. Horrific massacres of unarmed pilgrims became a grimly regular occurrence, undermining the very reason for the Crusades' existence. It was clear that a new, more permanent solution was needed. This solution would emerge in the form of two of the most famous and influential institutions of the Middle Ages, the military orders. The first of these, the Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, or the Hospitallers, had existed in a different form even before the Crusade. They began as a monastic brotherhood founded by Italian merchants in the 11th century to run a hospital in Jerusalem that provided care for sick and impoverished pilgrims. Theirs was a mission of pure charity and healing. After the conquest, their work expanded, and in 1113, the Pope officially recognized them as a religious order under his direct protection. But living in the violent frontier society of Outremer, the Brothers of the Hospital soon realized that their mission had to evolve. Healing a pilgrim's wounds after he had been attacked on the road to Jerusalem was a noble calling, but preventing the attack in the first place was even better. And so, in the decades following the First Crusade, the mainstream historical fact is that the Hospitallers underwent a gradual militarization. Alongside their primary charitable work, they began to hire soldiers and eventually allowed their own brothers to take up arms to escort and protect the pilgrim caravans. While the Hospitallers evolved into a military role, a second order was born directly into it. Around the year 1119, a French knight from the region of Champagne named Hugues de Payens, a veteran of the First Crusade who had remained in the Holy Land, was moved by the constant slaughter on the roads. He and 8 other like-minded knights presented themselves to the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, with a radical proposal. They wished to form a new kind of religious order, one dedicated solely to the active, armed protection of pilgrims. They would take the 3 traditional monastic vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they would fulfill their sacred duty not with prayer books in a quiet cloister, but with swords in their hands on the dangerous road to Jaffa. This idea of a warrior monk was a revolutionary concept that flew in the face of the established social order. For centuries, medieval society had been neatly divided into 3 groups: those who prayed, the clergy; those who fought, the nobility; and those who worked, the peasantry. A man was a knight, or he was a monk. He could not be both. Knights were worldly figures, driven by a desire for land, wealth, and glory. Monks were men of peace, removed from the bloody affairs of the world. The proposal by Hugues de Payens to fuse these 2 seemingly opposite callings into a single vocation was a strange and potent new idea. The medieval equivalent of suggesting your local librarian should also be a member of a SWAT team. King Baldwin II, however, was a practical ruler facing a desperate security crisis. He saw the genius in the idea and gave the 9 knights his full support. He granted the fledgling order a headquarters in a wing of his own royal palace, which was located on the Temple Mount, the site the Crusaders believed to be the location of the biblical Temple of Solomon. From this prestigious address, the new order took its name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, a grand title that was quickly shortened to the far more memorable Knights Templar. In their early years, the poor part of their name was certainly accurate. For nearly a decade, the order consisted of only those 9 founding members. Legend holds they were so impoverished that Hugues de Payan and his co-founder, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, had to share a single horse, an image of humility that would later be immortalized on their official seal. These 2 orders, the Hospitaller and the Templars, one born of charity and the other of war, would grow to become the twin pillars of the kingdom's defense, its most elite soldiers and wealthiest landowners, the unwavering shield of the precarious Christian kingdom beyond the sea. In the decades following the First Crusade, the precarious Christian states of Outremer began to put down roots. The second generation of Franks was now coming of age, men and women born in the East who had never seen the ancestral lands of France or Germany their parents had left behind. Under capable rulers like King Baldwin II and his successor, King Fulk of Anjou, the Kingdom of Jerusalem consolidated its power, building a network of magnificent castles and securing its borders. The Italian city-states of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa established lucrative trading posts in the coastal cities, bringing a new level of wealth and prosperity to the kingdom. Life settled into a strange but stable routine, a unique frontier culture where a French-speaking nobility ruled over a diverse populace, all living under the constant, humming tension of a perpetual holy war. This fragile stability, however, depended on one crucial factor: the continued disunity of their Muslim neighbors. So long as the emirs of Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul were more interested in fighting each other than in fighting the Franks, the kingdom could survive. But that was about to change. The Christian presence in the Levant was not one unified kingdom, but 4 separate states, each with its own ruler and its own strategic challenges. In the south was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the richest and most powerful. North of it lay the small county of Tripoli and the powerful principality of Antioch. But the 4th state, the county of Edessa, was the outlier. It was the northernmost, the most isolated, and the most vulnerable of the Crusader states. Sprawling east of the Euphrates River, Edessa was a landlocked island, cut off from the easy sea-based support that sustained the other states. It was a lonely Christian outpost surrounded by the major centers of Turkish power. Its survival had always been a minor miracle, a testament to the skill of its first rulers and the infighting of its enemies. By the 1130s, a new and formidable leader was rising in the Muslim world, a man who would begin the long and bloody process of rolling back the Crusader conquest. His name was Ahmed ad-Din Zengi, the Turkish Atabeg, or governor of the great cities of Mosul and Aleppo. Zengi was a brilliant and utterly ruthless commander, a man driven by a fierce ambition to unify the Muslim states of Syria and Iraq under his own rule. He was also the first major Muslim leader to effectively harness the powerful ideology of jihad, or holy struggle, as a political tool, presenting himself not just as a conqueror, but as the champion of Islam against the foreign invaders. Historians still argue Whether Zengi was a genuinely pious unifier or a pragmatic warlord who simply used the language of holy war to justify his own territorial ambitions. Whatever his motives, the result was the creation of a powerful, unified state on Edessa's doorstep. The ruler of Edessa at this time, Count Jocelyn II, was a weak and complacent man born in the east and possessing little of the grim determination of his crusading father. In the autumn of 1144, Jocelyn made a fatal error. He became embroiled in a dispute with another Muslim prince and marched the bulk of the Edessan army out of the city to support his ally, leaving his own capital dangerously undefended. Zengi, whose intelligence network was excellent, saw his chance. He immediately abandoned his other campaigns and force-marched his army to Edessa, surrounding the city before the Count had any idea what was happening. The siege was short and brutal. The city's massive ancient walls were famously strong, but its defenders were few, and the large native Armenian Christian population, who deeply resented the rule of their Latin Catholic lords, offered little assistance. Zengi's army was equipped with powerful siege engines and skilled miners who began to dig tunnels, propping them with timber to collapse the foundations of the walls. On Christmas Eve of 1144, after a siege of just 4 weeks, a major section of the wall near the Gate of the Hours was brought down. Zengi's troops poured through the breach. An initial slaughter was followed by a pragmatic order from Zengi to spare the native Christians, but the city's Frankish population was either killed in the fighting or rounded up to be sold in the slave markets of Aleppo. The great county of Edessa, the oldest of the Crusader states, had been effectively destroyed. News of the fall of Edessa traveled slowly to the west, but when it arrived, it was met with a wave of shock and horror. For nearly half a century, the Christians of Europe had come to believe that the success of the First Crusade was a sign of God's irreversible favor. The Frankish hold on the Holy Land they had assumed was permanent. The loss of Edessa shattered this illusion. It was the first major territory to be lost, a catastrophic reversal that suggested God's favor had been withdrawn. An atmosphere of crisis gripped the continent. The Pope, Eugenius III, knew that a dramatic response was needed, a new great expedition to the east to reclaim what was lost and save the remaining Christian kingdoms from a similar fate. The stage was set for the Second Crusade. The news from the east, carried on merchant ships and in the letters of horrified clerics, fell upon a Europe that was far more complacent than it had been 50 years earlier. The loss of Edessa was a shock, but the initial call for a new crusade, issued by Pope Eugenius III in December of 1145, was met with a notable lack of enthusiasm. The raw, explosive zeal of 1095 had cooled into its more established tradition. To ignite the fire once more, the Pope knew he needed an extraordinary voice, a man whose spiritual authority was so immense that he could command the attention of all Christendom. He turned to the Cistercian abbot, Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard was, by this time, the most powerful and revered religious figure in Europe. He was the great champion of the Knights Templar, a mystic, a brilliant theologian, and a political operator whose influence extended into every royal court on the continent. When he spoke, it was said, it was as if the voice of God himself were thundering from the pulpit. Reluctantly at first, Bernard accepted the task of preaching the new crusade, and he threw his entire formidable energy into the mission. He was not just a preacher. He was a master promoter, an orchestrator of a continent-wide campaign to rally the faithful. His sermons were masterpieces of emotional rhetoric, calling upon the knights of Europe to take up arms not just for their own salvation, but for their honor, to avenge the insult to Christ, and to repay the debt they owed him. The official launch of the Second Crusade took place at Vézelay, in the French Duchy of Burgundy, at Easter of 1146. A huge crowd gathered, so large that no church could hold them, and they assembled on a hillside just as they had at Clermont. There, Bernard delivered a sermon of such power that the assembled nobility were overcome with emotion. At his side was the young King of France, Louis VII. Louis was a deeply pious man who was haunted by a personal sin. Years earlier, during a war with one of his vassals, his troops had set fire to a church at a town called Vitry, killing over 1,000 people who had taken refuge inside. The mainstream historical fact is that this personal guilt was a heavy burden on the young king's conscience, and he saw in the crusade a sacred opportunity for penance and redemption. When Bernard finished speaking, Louis was the first to step forward and receive the cloth cross from the abbot's hand. A wave of enthusiasm then swept the crowd, and soon so many nobles were clamoring for a cross that Bernard ran out of the ones he had prepared and was forced to start tearing his own monastic robes into strips to satisfy the demand. With the King of France committed, Bernard turned his attention to the great prize, the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III of Germany. Conrad was a much tougher sell. He was an older, more pragmatic ruler, bogged down in the complex and violent politics of the German Empire, and he had little interest in a costly and dangerous foreign expedition. Bernard pursued him relentlessly, preaching across the Rhineland. The final dramatic confrontation came at Speyer during the Christmas court of 1146. Bernard delivered a sermon directly to the emperor, taking on the voice of Christ himself and confronting Conrad from the cross, asking him, "O man, what is it that I have not done for you that I ought to have done?" He listed the gifts of power, wealth, and health that God had bestowed upon the emperor, and then demanded to know what Conrad would offer in return. The emperor was completely overcome. He broke down in tears before his entire court and declared that he too would take the cross. It was a moment of pure theological theater, a stunning victory for Bernard that had secured the leadership of the two most powerful monarchs in Western Europe. Unlike the First Crusade, which had been led by dukes and counts, this was to be a crusade of kings. The scale of the preparations was immense, the expectations for success astronomically high. This would be a better organized, better funded, and far more powerful expedition than the first. The very definition of crusading was also expanding. Bernard and the Pope authorized parallel crusades, offering the same spiritual rewards to German knights fighting the pagan Wends across the Elbe River, and to Spanish knights fighting the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula. The Holy War was becoming a global franchise. Yet amid this grand organization, the same dark undercurrents of fanaticism that had marred the First Crusade resurfaced. A rogue Cistercian monk named Radolf began preaching unauthorized sermons in the Rhineland, inciting mobs to attack Jewish communities once more. To his immense credit, Bernard, horrified by the news, traveled personally to Germany to confront Radolf, silence him, and publicly condemn the violence, reminding the people that the Jews were not to be persecuted. Having put out that fire, the great preacher could rest. The two vast armies of France and Germany, tens of thousands strong, were finally on the move, marching eastward in a magnificent display of Christian power, confident that a glorious victory awaited them. The two great armies of the Second Crusade, the largest Christian forces ever to march east, set off with a level of confidence bordering on arrogance. This magnificent expedition, led by kings and blessed by the most holy man in Europe, could not possibly fail. The reality, however, would be a swift and brutal lesson in the perils of overconfidence. The German army, under Emperor Conrad III, marched first, taking the supposedly direct overland route through the interior of Anatolia. Conrad haughtily dismissed the advice of the Byzantine emperor, Manuel the Vizier Komnenos, who had warned him of the dangers and urged him to stick to the safer coastal road. It was a disastrous decision. In late October of 1147, near the very same spot at Dorylaeum where the First Crusade had won its great victory, Conrad's army, poorly supplied and dangerously spread out, walked directly into a Seljuk ambush. The German knights, weighed down by their heavy armor, were no match for the swift tactics of the Turkish horse archers. The army was annihilated. Conrad himself was wounded, but managed to escape with a few thousand terrified survivors, straggling back to the city of Nicaea. The great German crusade was over before it had even reached Syria. The French army, led by King Louis XVII, followed a few weeks later. Having learned from Conrad's fate, they took the longer, safer coastal route. But safer did not mean safe. Their march was a grueling ordeal, constantly harassed by Turkish skirmishers. Their own moment of catastrophe came in January of 1148, as the army was crossing the treacherous terrain of Mount Cadmus in western Anatolia. The vanguard, led by an impatient nobleman, pushed too far ahead, leaving the main column, which included the slow-moving baggage train and thousands of vulnerable pilgrims, stretched out and exposed along the narrow mountain pass. The Turks, watching from the heights, seized their chance and attacked the isolated column, raining down arrows and boulders. The result was a massacre. The French forces were trapped and cut to pieces. King Louis himself was separated from his bodyguard and only survived by scrambling up a large rock and, thanks to his superior armor, fighting off his attackers single-handedly. In the aftermath of this disaster, the French army was a broken and demoralized mob. The authority of the king's bickering nobles had completely collapsed. In a stunning admission of their failure, King Louis handed over tactical command of the entire army to the Knights Templar who were traveling with him. The warrior monks immediately imposed their rigid discipline on the panicked survivors, reorganizing them into a cohesive fighting force and successfully guiding the remnant of the army to the coast, saving it from total destruction. While a disaster for the crusade, the incident was a massive public relations victory for the Templars, cementing their reputation as the only truly reliable soldiers in Christendom. The battered survivors of both the French and German armies eventually limped their way to the Holy Land. They were not the triumphant relief force the local barons had been praying for, but a shadow of their former selves. In June of 1148, the visiting kings, the German emperor, and the Queen of Jerusalem met with the assembled nobility of Outremer at a great council in the city of Acre to decide what to do. Their original goal, the recapture of Edessa, was now deemed strategically impossible. They needed a new, prestigious target, one that was closer to hand. They made a decision that was so politically inept, it remains baffling to this day. They decided to attack Damascus. This was a catastrophic blunder. Damascus was, at that moment, the only major Muslim power in the region that was an ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its ruler was in a formal truce with the Franks, and his city served as a vital buffer state against the growing power of their true enemy, Nur al-Din, the son of Zengi, who now ruled a unified state in Aleppo and Mosul. By attacking Damascus, the Crusaders were effectively attacking their own ally and doing their enemy's work for him. Historians still argue vociferously about why this insane decision was made. Was it the strategic ignorance of the newly arrived European kings, or the selfish ambition of the local barons who coveted the rich agricultural lands surrounding Damascus for themselves? Whatever the reason, the combined armies marched on the city. They initially had some success, fighting their way through the dense orchards and gardens that protected the western side of Damascus. But then, after just a few days, in a move that has been debated for centuries, the leaders decided to shift their main attack to the eastern side of the city. This new position was a barren, waterless plain, completely exposed and indefensible. The change in tactics was so nonsensical that it immediately gave rise to rumors that the local Frankish lords had been bribed to give the disastrous advice. With no water, and with news that Nur al-Din's army was approaching to relieve the city, the great Crusader host panicked. After only 4 days of fighting, the siege was abandoned in a humiliating and disorganized retreat. The Second Crusade was over. It had achieved nothing, cost a fortune in lives and treasure, and its only tangible result was to destroy the crucial alliance with Damascus, which soon after fell into the hands of a grateful Nur al-Din. The crusade had failed in every possible way, leaving the Christian states of Outremer in a far more dangerous position than they had been in before the kings had ever arrived. The spectacular failure of the Second Crusade left a bitter taste across Europe and a grim new reality in the Holy Land. The Crusaders had not only failed to recapture Edessa, they had managed to destroy the one stable Muslim alliance the Kingdom of Jerusalem possessed, effectively handing the city of Damascus to their primary enemy, Nur al-Din. This blunder allowed Nur al-Din to achieve what his father Zengi had only dreamed of: the unification of Muslim Syria under a single, powerful ruler. Nur al-Din was a very different kind of leader from his father. Where Zengi had been a brutal and pragmatic warlord, Nur al-Din was a genuinely pious and astute statesman. He understood that a successful war against the Franks required not just armies, but an idea. He embarked on a project of moral and spiritual renewal, using his vast wealth to build mosques, religious schools, and hospitals across his domain. He cultivated an image of himself as a just and ascetic ruler, the true champion of a reinvigorated jihad. He was laying the ideological groundwork for the Great Reconquest, creating a unified state with a powerful sense of purpose. By the mid-12th century, the political map of the Middle East was a tense, three-way standoff. There was the Zengid Empire of Nur al-Din in Syria, the Christian Crusader states clinging to the coast, and to the south, the ancient and fabulously wealthy land of Egypt. Egypt was ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty that had been in power for 2 centuries, but was now in a state of terminal decline. The caliphs were mere children, puppets in the hands of their scheming viziers, or prime ministers, who constantly plotted and fought against one another. Egypt was politically unstable, but its agricultural wealth and its strategic position made it the ultimate prize. Both Nur al-Din in Damascus and the shrewd king of Jerusalem, Amalric, understood a simple truth. Whoever controlled Egypt would control the entire region. The fate of Outremer would be decided on the banks of the Nile. What followed in the 1160s was a frantic and complex series of military campaigns, a race to dominate Egypt. King Amalric invaded Egypt multiple times, seeking to prop up a friendly vizier and turn the country into a protectorate of his kingdom. Each time, Nur al-Din responded by sending his own army into Egypt to counter the Frankish moves. His most trusted general for these campaigns was a fierce, one-eyed Kurdish warrior named Shirkuh, and serving as Shirkuh's loyal lieutenant and nephew was a quiet, scholarly young man who was reportedly more interested in religious studies than in warfare. His name was Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, a name the West would shorten to Saladin. Historians still debate the sincerity of Saladin's supposed early reluctance for a military career, but on the battlefield in Egypt, he proved to be a gifted and capable commander. In 1169, after a final successful campaign that drove the Franks out for good, Shirkuh was installed as the new vizier of Egypt. His triumph, however, was short-lived. He died just 2 months later, supposedly from overindulging at a feast. The Fatimid court, looking for a replacement they believed would be weak and easy to manipulate, made the surprising choice of the young and seemingly unassuming Saladin. It would prove to be one of the greatest political miscalculations in history. Saladin, the quiet scholar, revealed himself to be a master of political maneuvering. He moved swiftly and ruthlessly to consolidate his power, executing his rivals, crushing rebellions within the Egyptian army, and placing his own loyal family members in all key positions. He was now the undisputed master of Egypt, ruling in the name of the Fatimid Caliph, but in reality reporting to his own master, Nur al-Din, back in Damascus. In 1171, he took the final revolutionary step. Acting on Nur al-Din's orders, Saladin abolished the 200-year-old Shi'i Fatimid Caliphate altogether, proclaiming Egypt's return to the authority of the Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. It was a monumental event that at a stroke healed a major religious schism and brought the 2 great centers of Muslim power, Egypt and Syria, under a single unified religious banner. Saladin was now the lord of the richest province in the Muslim world, but he was still, in theory, Nur al-Din's subordinate. The relationship between the 2 great men grew increasingly tense. Nur al-Din became deeply suspicious of his powerful viceroy, who seemed to be dragging his feet when it came to joining in on combined attacks against the Franks. An open war between the two seemed imminent, but fate intervened. In 1174, Nur al-Din died suddenly of an illness. His death left his empire to his 11-year-old son, and it immediately began to fragment as rival emirs sought to carve out their own domains. Saladin saw his moment. Declaring himself the true political and spiritual successor to Nur al-Din, he marched from Egypt into Syria. Over the next 12 years, through a brilliant combination of shrewd diplomacy, relentless propaganda, and decisive military victories, he systematically brought Damascus, Aleppo, and eventually Mosul under his control. By 1186, the dream of Zengi and Nur al-Din was finally realized. From the Nile in Egypt to the Tigris in Iraq, the Muslim Near East was united under the rule of a single, brilliant leader. The Crusader states were now completely surrounded by the vast Ayyubid Empire, an iron ring closing around them. Their day of reckoning was at hand. With the Muslim world united under his firm control, Saladin's gaze now turned to the Christian kingdom that was an irritating splinter in the heart of his empire. The kingdom of Jerusalem, for its part, was in a state of terminal political decay, a condition that would prove far more lethal than any external threat. Its heroic king, Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King, was a brilliant and courageous ruler. But by the 1180s, his debilitating disease had left him blind and bedridden. His slow, tragic decline created a power vacuum at the heart of the court, which descended into vicious factional infighting. On one side were the established local barons, led by the wise and pragmatic Raymond III of Tripoli, who understood the kingdom's military limitations and advocated for maintaining truces with Saladin. On the other was a hawkish faction of aggressive newcomers, led by the hot-headed Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, and a reckless, treaty-breaking lord named Reynald of Chatillon. Reynald of Chatillon was a man who seemed to take a perverse delight in provocation. From his mighty desert fortress of Kerak, he controlled the caravan routes between Egypt and Syria. He had once outraged the entire Muslim world by launching a fleet of ships on the Red Sea to raid pilgrim vessels on their way to Mecca. But in the winter of 1186, he committed his final, fatal outrage. In direct violation of a truce between the kingdom and Saladin, Reynald attacked a massive and wealthy caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus. It was an act of pure banditry, and it was a profound personal and political insult that Saladin could not ignore. He demanded that Reynald release the prisoners and return the stolen goods. The new king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, a weak and indecisive ruler who owed his throne to Reynald's faction, was unable to compel his rebellious vassal to comply. Enraged, Saladin swore a sacred oath that he would kill Reynald of Chatillon with his own hands. He began to muster the largest army his new empire could produce, calling for warriors from Egypt, Syria, and Iraq for a holy war to finally destroy the kingdom of Jerusalem. In response, the Franks levied every fighting man they had, assembling the largest army in the kingdom's history, perhaps 1,500 knights and 15,000 infantry, at a strong, well-watered defensive position called the Springs of Sephoria. Saladin crossed the Jordan River and laid siege to Raymond of Tripoli's city of Tiberias, hoping to lure the Frankish army out into the open. The ruse worked perfectly. A fateful war council was held in King Guy's tent. Raymond of Tripoli, whose own wife was now trapped in the besieged city, made a courageous and strategically brilliant argument. They must stay put. Their position at Sephoria was secure. Saladin's massive army was deep in hostile territory in the blistering heat of July. If they simply waited, the enemy would run out of water and supplies and be forced to withdraw. It was better, Raymond argued, to lose the city of Tiberias than to risk losing the entire kingdom. But Gérard de Riedfort, the Templar Grand Master, who held a bitter personal grudge against Raymond, saw his chance. He rose and publicly accused Raymond of cowardice and treason. Along with Reynald of Châtillon, he relentlessly goaded the weak-willed King Guy, shaming him into proving his valor. In a moment of catastrophic folly, the king ignored the advice of his wisest counselor and gave the order to march. On the morning of July 3rd, 1187, the entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem abandoned its safe, well-watered camp and marched out into a barren, waterless desert to meet Saladin on his own terms. The march was an immediate descent into hell. Under a merciless sun, the heavily armored men began to suffer terribly from thirst. Saladin's light cavalry swarmed around them, constantly harassing the column and setting fires in the dry grass ahead, choking the Franks with thick, acrid smoke. The precious water they carried was quickly consumed. By the end of the day, having covered less than 15 miles, the army was on the verge of collapse, tormented by a thirst so profound it drove men mad. They were forced to make camp on a dry, rocky plain, completely surrounded by Saladin's forces, within sight of a twin-peaked hill known as the Horns of Hattin. The battle the next day, July 4th, was not a contest. It was a slaughter. At dawn, Saladin's forces set fire to the brush on all sides, enveloping the Christian camp in smoke and heat, and then began their attack. The Frankish infantry, crazed with thirst, broke ranks and tried to flee towards the distant shimmer of the Sea of Galilee, only to be cut down or forced to surrender in their thousands. The knights, fighting with the courage of despair, made a series of futile charges. A group led by Raymond of Tripoli managed to break through the enemy lines and escape, an act of survival that would haunt his reputation for the rest of his life. The last stand took place on one of the horns of the hill. A small, desperate knot of knights gathered around King Guy's red tent and the kingdom's most sacred relic, a piece of the true cross. One by one, they were overwhelmed. By the afternoon, it was over. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been completely annihilated. The king was a captive. The Grand Master of the Templars was a captive. Reynald of Châtillon was a captive. And the true cross, the symbol of their faith and the banner under which they had fought for nearly a century, was lost. The kingdom was now utterly and completely defenseless. In the immediate aftermath of the slaughter at Hattin, the high-ranking Christian prisoners were brought before Saladin in his magnificent command tent. What followed was a scene of stark and calculated judgment. The Sultan received the captive King Guy of Lusignan with the courtesy due to a monarch, offering him a goblet of snow-chilled rosewater as a sign that his life would be spared. When the parched king drank and then passed the goblet to Reynold of Chatillon, Saladin's demeanor hardened. He informed the interpreter to make it clear that it was the king and not he who had given the man a drink, a chilling statement that meant Reynold was not under the protection of his hospitality. Saladin then confronted Reynold, listing his many crimes and broken truces. He offered him the choice of converting to Islam, and when the defiant lord refused, the Sultan fulfilled the oath he had sworn, striking Reynold with his own sword before his bodyguards finished the execution. A different, though equally grim, fate awaited the captured knights of the military orders. Saladin considered the Templars and Hospitallers to be the ideological heart of the Frankish war machine, men who were bound by their holy vows never to be ransomed. He offered the more than 200 captured warrior monks a simple choice: renounce their faith and embrace Islam or die. To a man, they chose martyrdom. They were led out and beheaded in a mass execution that in a single evening wiped out the elite veteran corps of both orders. It was a catastrophic blow from which the kingdom's military strength would never truly recover. With its army gone and its leadership captured or dead, the kingdom of Jerusalem fell apart with a speed that was breathtaking. Saladin simply began his march, and the great cities and castles of the realm dissolved before him. Acre, the kingdom's wealthiest port, surrendered without a fight. Nablus, Jaffa, Sidon, and Beirut followed in quick succession. The entire kingdom, which had been built over nearly a century of struggle and sacrifice, was undone in a matter of weeks. The only significant point of resistance was the port city of Tyre, where the timely arrival of a powerful nobleman from the west, Conrad of Montferrat, allowed a stubborn and successful defense to be organized. Tyre would become the tiny, defiant toehold from which the Christians would later attempt to rebuild. But Saladin's true prize lay inland. By September of 1187, just 2 months after the victory at Hattin, his vast army stood before the walls of Jerusalem. The holy city was in a state of panic. It was swollen with terrified refugees who had fled the countryside, but it was almost completely devoid of soldiers to defend it. The defense was hastily organized by Balian of Ibelin, one of the few high-ranking nobles who had managed to escape the disaster at Hattin. His situation was hopeless. He had, by his own account, fewer than a dozen knights left in the entire city. In a desperate move, he knighted the sons of merchants and any other man who could bear arms, but he knew they could not possibly hold out against Saladin's veteran army and his powerful siege engines. After a siege of less than 2 weeks, Saladin's miners began to breach a section of the northern wall. Balian, seeing that the end was near, went to Saladin's tent to negotiate a surrender. He made a grim and desperate threat. If merciful terms were not offered, the defenders would not only fight to the last man, they would first kill the 5,000 Muslim prisoners they held in the city and destroy the sacred Islamic shrines on the Temple Mount, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Saladin, a pious man who wished to take the holy city without desecrating it, agreed to a peaceful and orderly surrender. The contrast with the Frankish conquest of 1099 could not have been more stark. There would be no massacre. The terms were simple. The city's Christian inhabitants could ransom their own freedom for a fixed price, 10 gold dinars for a man, 5 for a woman. Those who could not pay would be taken into slavery. On October the 2nd, 1187, 88 years to the day after the First Crusade had reached the city, Saladin's emirs took possession of the Tower of David. The great golden cross was removed from the top of the Dome of the Rock, and Saladin's yellow banner was raised over Jerusalem. The mainstream historical fact is that Saladin's entry into the city was a model of clemency and order. While thousands who could not afford the ransom were indeed marched away into bondage, Saladin was moved by the plight of the poor. He and his brother Al-Adil used their own money to ransom thousands, and they allowed many of the elderly to leave freely without any payment at all. He respected the holy sites of the Eastern Orthodox Christians and ensured that no one was harmed in the process of the handover. This act of chivalrous mercy cemented his reputation throughout the world as a just and honorable conqueror. For the people of Europe, however, the news that Jerusalem, the city won with the blood of their grandfathers, was once again lost was a spiritual cataclysm, a profound shock that would demand the mightiest response Christendom had ever conceived. The news that Jerusalem had fallen landed on Europe like a physical blow. The sense of shock, grief, and profound humiliation was universal. For nearly a century, the Holy City had been the ultimate symbol of Christian triumph, and its loss felt like a personal defeat for every believer, a sign that God had judged them and found them wanting. The new Pope, Gregory VIII, immediately issued a call for a new crusade, framing the disaster as a divine punishment for the sins of the West. This time, there was no hesitation, no need for a charismatic preacher to tour the land. The response came from the very top, from the three most powerful and prestigious monarchs in all of Christendom, who pledged to lead a combined force to reclaim the Holy Land. This was to be the Third Crusade, the Crusade of Three Kings, an undertaking of such epic scale and ambition that it dwarfed all that had come before it. To fund this colossal enterprise, the kings of England and France instituted an unprecedented new tax, the Saladin tithe, which demanded 1/10 of all revenues and property from every citizen who was not going on the crusade themselves. It was one of the first general national taxes in European history, and while it was deeply unpopular, it filled the war chests for the coming campaign. The first and most august of the rulers to take the cross was the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. Frederick was a living legend, nearly 70 years old, a veteran of the disastrous Second Crusade, and a ruler of immense experience and authority. His participation lent the crusade an unparalleled level of gravitas. He assembled a huge and meticulously organized German army, perhaps the largest of the three royal contingents, and in 1189 set off on the traditional overland route. Having learned from the mistakes that had doomed his previous campaign, he imposed iron discipline on his troops, and his march through the Balkans and into Anatolia was a model of military efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaos of earlier crusades. He brushed aside Byzantine resistance and won a crushing victory against the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Iconium, capturing their capital. The path to the Holy Land lay open, but then, in a moment of shocking and bizarre tragedy, the Great Crusade was decapitated. On June 10th, 1190, while crossing the Salif River in southern Anatolia, the elderly emperor fell from his horse into the cold mountain water and drowned. The mainstream historical fact is that he died in the river, but the exact circumstances remain a mystery. Did the shock of the cold water induce a heart attack, or did the great warrior, weighed down by his heavy armor, simply lose his footing and get swept away? His death was a catastrophic blow. The magnificent German army, now without its unifying leader, lost heart. Most of the soldiers turned back for home, while only a small, grief-stricken remnant continued on to the Holy Land under the command of Frederick's son. The other two monarchs, King Philip II of France and the new King of England, Richard the Ears, known to history as the Lionheart, were a study in contrasts. Philip, called Augustus for his success in expanding the French kingdom, was a shrewd, patient, and calculating political operator. He was no great warrior, but a master of diplomacy and intrigue. Richard, by contrast, was the archetypal warrior king, a brilliant and ferocious battlefield commander, and arguably the greatest military mind of his age. He had only just taken the English throne, but the Crusade was his life's obsession. He immediately set about raising money with single-minded determination, selling off castles, titles, and offices. He famously remarked that he would have sold London itself if he could find a buyer. For Richard, England was not so much a kingdom to be governed as it was a bank to be emptied in service of the Holy War. These two men, Philip and Richard, were also the bitterest of rivals. The English king, through his Angevin inheritance, controlled not only England, but also more than half of France, a situation the French king was determined to change. They were locked in a cold war for the future of France, and they distrusted each other so profoundly that they would only agree to go on crusade together, swearing a solemn oath not to attack one another's lands while they were away. It was an alliance born not of friendship, but of mutual suspicion, the medieval equivalent of two feuding executives agreeing to carpool to an important conference just to keep an eye on each other. Deciding to learn from Barbarossa's fate, they chose not to march overland, but to transport their vast armies by sea, a safer but far more expensive option. In the summer of 1190, their great fleets, a forest of masts and sails, finally departed from the port of Marseille, bound for the east. The hopes of Christendom now rested on the shoulders of these two quarrelsome kings, sailing towards the beleaguered Christian remnant that was desperately clinging to the single, defiant city of Tyre. The long sea journey of the French and English kings was anything but direct, especially for Richard the Lionheart, who seemed incapable of passing up an opportunity for a profitable and glorious detour. The two kings decided to winter in Sicily in late 1190, and the island's volatile politics immediately drew Richard in. In a dispute over his sister's dowry, he promptly stormed and captured the city of Messina, a move that greatly enriched his war chest, but also profoundly irritated his rival Philip, who looked on with disapproval at what he saw as an unseemly and distracting brawl. The irritation deepened into a permanent rift. The following spring, as Richard's fleet continued eastward, a storm scattered his ships, and the vessel carrying his sister Joan and his new fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre, was shipwrecked on the island of Cyprus. The island's ruler, a renegade Byzantine prince named Isaac Komnenos foolishly mistreated the survivors and took them hostage. Richard's response was immediate and overwhelming. He landed his army, and in a lightning campaign that lasted less than a month, he utterly defeated Isaac's forces and conquered the entire island of Cyprus. It was a brilliant, unplanned military success that would have enormous consequences. The island, with its strategic location and agricultural wealth, would serve as the primary supply base for the Christian forces in the Levant for the next 300 years. For Richard, at that moment, it was simply another asset to be liquidated. He promptly sold the island to his friends, the Knights Templar, further filling his coffers for the war ahead. These sideshows, while demonstrating Richard's incredible energy and military talent, meant that it was not until June of 1191 that he finally arrived in the Holy Land. He arrived at a scene of grinding misery. For 2 long years, the Christian forces of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, along with the German remnants of Barbarossa's army, had been locked in a desperate siege of the great port city of Acre. It was one of the strangest and most brutal sieges in history. The Christian army had surrounded the Muslim garrison inside the city, but they themselves were now surrounded by Saladin's main field army, which had encircled their camp. It was a siege within a siege, a nightmarish stalemate of attrition where both sides suffered terribly from famine and disease. King Philip of France had arrived a few months before Richard and had begun the construction of massive siege engines, but the deadlock remained. Richard's arrival, with a fresh English army, a fleet full of supplies, and a fearsome reputation, electrified the exhausted Christian camp. With the Lionheart now on the scene, the character of the siege changed. The assaults on the city walls became relentless and methodical. Richard, a skilled military engineer, directed the placement of huge stone-throwing catapults that battered the city's defenses day and night. Even when he was struck down with a severe fever, he refused to rest, ordering his men to carry him on a silken stretcher to the front lines so he could personally direct the fire of his crossbowmen. Saladin's army launched repeated attacks on the Christian camp, but they could not break through. Under this immense, unrelenting pressure, the will of the city's Muslim defenders finally broke. On July 12th, 1191, after a siege of 23 months, the garrison of Acre surrendered. The terms were steep. The city was to be handed over, along with its entire fleet, and a ransom of 200,000 gold pieces. Crucially, Saladin also promised to return 1,500 Christian prisoners, and, most importantly of all, the holy relic of the true cross that had been lost at the Battle of Hattin. It was a tremendous victory, the first major success of the Crusade, but the triumph was about to be stained by an act of shocking brutality. In the weeks that followed, the handover of the ransom money and the Christian prisoners stalled. There were delays and disputes. Richard, convinced that Saladin was deliberately stalling for time and impatient to begin his march south to Jerusalem, made a ruthless decision. On the 20th of August, he declared that the terms of the truce had been broken. He ordered that the nearly 3,000 Muslim soldiers of the Acre garrison, who were now his prisoners, be marched out of the city, and in full view of Saladin's horrified army, they were all executed. Historians still argue about Richard's motives for the massacre. Was it a cold-blooded act of strategic terror designed to show Saladin he was a man who would stop at nothing? Or was it a grimly pragmatic, if savage, solution to the logistical problem of what to do with thousands of enemy prisoners on the eve of a long and dangerous campaign? Whatever the reason, it was an act of extreme violence that stood in stark contrast to Saladin's mercy at Jerusalem 4 years earlier. Shortly after this grim event, King Philip, having fulfilled his crusading vow and being utterly fed up with playing second fiddle to the glorious and overbearing Richard, announced he was going home. Pleading ill health, he left a portion of his army behind and sailed back to France, where he promptly began plotting to seize Richard's French territories. The uneasy alliance of the two kings was over. The Lionheart was now in sole command of the Third Crusade. With King Philip on his way home, Richard the Lionheart was now the undisputed commander of the Third Crusade. After the grim business at Acre, his first objective was to march the army south along the coast to secure the port of Jaffa, the traditional launching point for an advance on Jerusalem. Richard, a superb logistician, knew this would be the most dangerous phase of the campaign. He organized his army with meticulous care for the grueling 90-mile march. The infantry, a disciplined mix of spearmen and crossbowmen, marched on the landward side, forming a continuous moving wall to protect the precious heavy cavalry from the constant harassment of the enemy. On the seaward side, his fleet sailed in parallel, providing a constant source of fresh supplies and a place to evacuate the wounded. It was a slow, disciplined, and brutally effective formation, a marching fortress inching its way through hostile territory. Saladin, for his part, shadowed the Crusader army every step of the way. He threw his entire force at the Christian column, launching wave after wave of his famed Turkish horse archers, who would ride in, fire a volley of arrows, and ride away before a counterattack could be mounted. He sent in skirmishers to attack the baggage train, and his infantry to engage the Christian foot soldiers. The heat was oppressive, the dust was choking, and the psychological pressure of being under constant attack was immense. But under Richard's iron-willed command, the army held its discipline, repulsing every attack and continuing its slow, inexorable advance. Frustrated by his inability to break the Crusader formation, Saladin finally committed his entire army to a full-scale, set-piece battle on September 7th, 1191, near the town of Arsuf. For hours, the Crusaders endured a massive assault, with the Knights Hospitaller in the rearguard bearing the brunt of the attack. Richard rode up and down the lines, urging his men to hold their position, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash his own decisive weapon, a full-strength charge by his heavily armored knights. The moment was forced upon him when two Hospitaller knights, goaded beyond endurance, broke ranks and charged the enemy without orders. Richard, in a display of tactical genius, instantly turned a moment of insubordination into the main attack. He ordered a general charge, and the entire line of Frankish heavy cavalry, which he had held in reserve, crashed into Saladin's army like a thunderbolt. The impact was devastating. Saladin's forces were shattered and forced into a full retreat. The Battle of Arsuf was a stunning victory, Richard had defeated the great Saladin in open combat, breaking the spell of his invincibility and securing the road to Jaffa. After rebuilding the fortifications at Jaffa, Richard began his first advance inland toward Jerusalem in the winter of 1191. But the campaign was a miserable failure. Torrential rains turned the terrain into a sea of mud, and Saladin's scorched earth policy meant there were no supplies to be found. The Crusaders struggled to within 12 miles of the Holy City, but a council of their leaders, including the masters of the Templars and Hospitallers, advised the king to turn back. They argued that even if they could take the city, holding it through the winter, deep inland and cut off from supplies, would be impossible once the main crusading army eventually went home. With a heavy heart, Richard gave the order to retreat to the coast, a decision that was a crushing blow to his army's morale. The following summer, after months of refitting and further consolidating his control of the coast, Richard made a second, rapid advance on Jerusalem. Once again, he reached the same point, the small village of Beit Nuba, and once again, he was faced with the same grim strategic reality. According to legend, it was here that Richard rode to the top of a hill from which the holy city was visible. He raised his shield to cover his eyes, declaring that if he was not worthy enough to win back the Holy Sepulchre, he was not worthy to even look upon it. The mainstream historical fact is that Richard's decision to turn back, though emotionally devastating, was almost certainly the correct military choice. Conquest was a possibility. Holding the conquest was not. With urgent news from England that his brother John was plotting to usurp his throne, Richard knew his time in the East was running out. He turned from war to diplomacy. After one last, spectacular feat of arms, where he personally led a tiny force to save Jaffa from being recaptured, he and Saladin, the two great rivals who had developed a deep and chivalrous respect for one another, finally agreed to a truce. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, established a peace for 3 years. The Christians would retain control of the coastline from Tyre to Jaffa, effectively re-establishing the kingdom. And most importantly, unarmed Christian pilgrims were to be granted free and safe access to worship at the holy sites in Jerusalem. The city itself would remain under Saladin's control. The Third Crusade was over. Richard the Lionheart, having saved the Crusader states from annihilation, but having failed in his ultimate goal, sailed for home, never to return. The end of the Third Crusade left a fragile and unsatisfying peace in the Holy Land. Richard the Lionheart had saved the Crusader states from extinction, but Jerusalem itself remained under Muslim rule. In Europe, the crusading ideal was still a powerful force, but it was becoming harder to mobilize. The memory of the disasters of the Second Crusade and the inconclusive result of the Third had tempered the old enthusiasm with a new sense of realism. But the papacy had not given up. In 1198, one of the most formidable figures of the Middle Ages ascended to the papal throne, Pope Innocent III. He was a brilliant canon lawyer and a man of boundless ambition who held a profound belief in the supremacy of papal authority over all earthly kings. A successful crusade that finally recaptured Jerusalem was central to his grand vision for Christendom. He issued a new call to arms, but this time the great kings of Europe were conspicuously absent. The new king of England, Richard's brother John, and the French king Philip Augustus were locked in a bitter war for control of France, while the Holy Roman Emperor was busy feuding with the Pope himself. The call was instead answered by the high nobility, the great feudal princes of France, men like Count Thibaut of Champagne and Baldwin of Flanders. Learning from past failures, these new crusaders devised what was, on paper, a brilliant and sophisticated military strategy. They would not march overland, nor would they attack the heavily fortified cities of the Levant directly. Instead, they planned to strike at the very heart of the Ayyubid Empire, Egypt. By capturing a major port like Alexandria, they could control the immense wealth of the Nile Delta and use it as a powerful bargaining chip to trade for the return of Jerusalem. It was a sound plan, but it had one major logistical flaw. To transport a massive army of tens of thousands of men and their thousands of horses all the way to Egypt required a fleet of ships far beyond the capacity of the crusading lords to assemble. They needed to hire a professional, and for that, there was only one place to go: the great maritime republic of Venice. Venice was a city built on water, a commercial empire whose power was measured not in acres of land, but in the number of ships in its harbor. The Venetians were pragmatic merchants, and while they were Christians, their primary devotion was to the bottom line. Their ruler was the Doge, Enrico Dandolo, a man of incredible cunning and resolve, who was at this time over 90 years old and completely blind. In 1201, envoys from the Crusader leaders arrived in Venice to negotiate a contract. The scene in the Doge's palace must have been remarkable, the flower of French chivalry making a deal with the ancient, sightless master of the seas. The deal they struck was breathtaking in its scale. The Venetians agreed to construct and crew a fleet capable of transporting 33,500 men and 4,500 horses, and to provide them with provisions for an entire year. In return, the Crusaders agreed to pay the staggering sum of 85,000 silver marks. The contract was signed, the shipwrights of the Venetian arsenal were put to work, and the departure was set for the summer of 1202. As the Crusaders began to muster on the island of the Lido, off the coast of Venice, a catastrophic problem became apparent. Far fewer men had shown up than the leaders had anticipated. The original leader, Thibaut of Champagne, had died, and many knights, either lacking funds or preferring a different route, had made their own way to the Holy Land. The army that assembled numbered only around 12,000, less than a third of the force for which they had contracted the fleet. This meant they could not possibly pay the agreed-upon price. They pooled all their personal wealth, melting down their own silver plate, but they still came up 34,000 marks short of the total. The crusade was now bankrupt, stranded, and effectively the prisoners of their Venetian creditors, who had bankrupted their own city to build a fleet that was now sitting empty. It was then that the blind Doge, Enrico Dandolo, revealed his genius for ruthless pragmatism. He came to the Crusaders with a proposal. He saw their predicament, he said, and offered a way for them to defer their debt. He suggested they could pay off the remaining balance, not in silver, but in service. There was a city down the Dalmatian coast, the Christian city of Zara, which had recently rebelled against Venetian rule and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. If the Crusaders would lend their military might to help Venice recapture the city, their debt would be considered paid. The proposal was met with shock and outrage in the Crusader camp. They had taken a sacred vow to fight the enemies of Christ, and now they were being asked to attack a fellow Christian city for the commercial gain of Venice. The King of Hungary had even taken the cross himself, meaning his lands were supposed to be under the personal protection of the Pope. Many devout crusaders, led by a lord named Simon de Montfort, refused to be a part of such a perversion of their mission and left the army in disgust. But the majority of the leaders, trapped by their own poor planning and financial desperation, saw no other way out. They reluctantly agreed to Dandelo's deal. The Fourth Crusade had been hijacked by debt. In November of 1202, the Great Fleet, with red crosses on its sails, set a course not for Egypt, but for Zara. Arriving before the walls of Zara in November of 1202, the Fourth Crusade committed its first great sin. The citizens of the Christian port hung banners emblazoned with crosses from their walls, a clear sign to the approaching army that they were fellow believers. But the Crusaders, trapped by their debt to the Venetians, attacked anyway. The city fell after a brief siege and was brutally sacked, its plunder divided between the Franks and their Venetian masters. When news of this scandal reached Rome, Pope Innocent III was incandescent with fury. He promptly excommunicated the entire crusade. While he later lifted the ban on the Frankish knights, whom he saw as being victims of Venetian coercion, his excommunication of the unrepentant Venetians remained in place. The Holy Army was now a morally compromised force, operating under a cloud of papal condemnation as they settled into their captured city for the winter. It was during this winter of discontent at Zara that an even greater and more consequential temptation presented itself. An embassy arrived at the Crusader camp, representing a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos. The prince's story was a dramatic one. His father, the Emperor Isaac II, had been deposed, blinded, and imprisoned by his own brother, who now sat on the imperial throne as Alexios III. The young prince had escaped and was seeking a Western army to help him reclaim his rightful inheritance. He came to the Crusaders with an offer so extravagant it seemed to be the answer to all their prayers. If the crusading army would divert its course to Constantinople and restore him and his father to power, he would in return pay off their entire remaining debt to Venice, give them an additional 200,000 silver marks, provide them with 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the crusade to Egypt, and most astoundingly, he would heal the great schism of 1044 by placing the entire Greek Orthodox Church under the authority of the Pope in Rome. For the leaders of the crusade, especially the pragmatic Doge Dandolo, who held a long-standing grudge against the Byzantines for past commercial slights, the offer was irresistible. It would solve their crippling financial problems, massively reinforce their army, and achieve a goal, the union of the churches, that had been a papal dream for centuries. But for many of the ordinary knights and soldiers, this was the final straw. They had taken a sacred vow to travel to the Holy Land and fight for the recovery of Jerusalem. They had not signed up to be a mercenary army, intervening in the fantastically complex and treacherous politics of the Byzantine court. The army split into factions. A large and devout group, refusing to be part of another diversion, abandoned the main host and made their own way to Syria. But the leadership, driven by a combination of greed, ambition, and a desperate need to pay their bills, formally accepted the prince's offer. The Fourth Crusade, born with the goal of conquering Egypt, now set its sails for Constantinople. In the summer of 1203, the great Venetian fleet, the largest ever seen in those waters, arrived before the Theodosian walls of the greatest city in Christendom. The Crusaders were awestruck. They had never imagined a city of such size and magnificence. The initial assault was brilliantly executed. While the Frankish knights attacked the land walls, the Venetians launched a daring amphibious assault on the weaker sea walls along the Golden Horn. The blind 90-year-old doge, Enrico Dandolo, stood in the prow of his galley, the banner of Saint Mark held before him, and was among the first to land on the battlements. The attack was so successful that the usurping emperor Alexios III lost his nerve and fled the city in the dead of night. The people of Constantinople, seeing him gone, immediately released the blind Isaac II from his dungeon and placed him back on the throne. The Crusaders had achieved their objective with astonishing ease. They had restored the rightful emperor and now encamped outside the city, waiting for his son, Alexios III, to deliver on his extravagant promises. It soon became painfully clear that the young prince had written a check his empire could not cash. The imperial treasury was empty, and his desperate attempts to raise the promised silver by imposing crushing taxes and melting down sacred church icons made him hated by his own people. Tensions between the Greeks within the walls and the Latin crusaders camped outside exploded into riots and open street fighting. In January of 1204, a popular uprising overthrew both father and son. The young Alexios IV was strangled in his cell. A new, fiercely anti-Latin emperor seized power and sent a blunt message to the Crusaders: "Your puppet is dead, the deal is off, now leave." The Crusaders were now in a catastrophic position. They were cheated of their reward, their ships were still unpaid for, and they were stranded deep in hostile territory with winter approaching. They made a final, fateful decision. If they could not be paid by the city, they would pay themselves. They would take Constantinople for themselves. In April of 1204, they launched their second, final assault. After 3 days of brutal fighting, the Venetian galleys again broke through the sea walls. The crusading army poured into the city. What followed was one of the most shameful episodes in Christian history: the great sack of Constantinople. For 3 days, the army of the cross went on a horrific rampage of destruction, vandalism, and slaughter. The mainstream historical fact is that this was not merely looting, but a systematic attempt to destroy a rival culture. Palaces and libraries filled with priceless works of ancient Greek literature were put to the torch. Churches and monasteries were desecrated, their altars stripped bare, their holy relics stolen and shipped back to adorn the cathedrals of the West. The Venetians, ever organized, carried off the city's greatest artistic treasures, including the 4 magnificent bronze horses that would be placed atop St. Mark's Basilica. The Crusaders, who had left home to fight for Christ, had instead ended up destroying the ancient Christian empire of the East. The Fourth Crusade ended not in the Holy Land, but in the smoking ruins of Constantinople. The Crusaders, having conquered the greatest Christian city on earth, abandoned any pretense of continuing to Egypt. Instead, they carved up the Byzantine Empire amongst themselves, creating a fragile and short-lived Latin empire with Baldwin of Flanders as its first emperor. The Venetians took control of the most lucrative ports and islands, securing their commercial dominance of the Mediterranean. For the West, the Crusade was a scandalous success, bringing a flood of stolen wealth and holy relics back to the cathedrals of Europe. But in the grand story of the Holy War, it was a profound and demoralizing failure. The event created an unhealable wound between the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches, and it had done absolutely nothing to help the beleaguered Christian states in Syria. For many of the common people of Europe, the whole affair was a confirmation of a growing suspicion that the great lords and princes were no longer driven by pure faith, but by greed and worldly politics. The official crusading movement had lost its moral authority. This disillusionment created a spiritual vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed a new and extraordinary wave of popular piety. A belief began to spread that the sinful, worldly knights had failed because their hearts were not pure. The holy mission, it was whispered, could not be accomplished by the proud and the powerful, but only by the humble and the innocent. God, it was believed, would not grant victory to armies, but to his most beloved children. This idea, a mixture of profound faith and profound naivete, gave rise to one of the strangest and most tragic episodes of the entire medieval period, the so-called Children's Crusade. This was not a single, organized event, but a series of spontaneous popular movements that erupted in the summer of 1212. Historians now largely view these movements not as being comprised entirely of young children, but as a broader crusade of the poor. The Latin word used in the Chronicles, pueri, can mean either boys or the poor and powerless. It was a mass pilgrimage of the dispossessed, a tide of peasants, adolescents, and the landless poor, led by charismatic youthful prophets. The first of these movements began in France, led by a young shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes. He claimed that Christ had appeared to him disguised as a poor pilgrim and had given him a letter to be delivered to the French king. Stephen's passionate preaching and his supposed ability to perform miracles attracted a huge following, and he led a procession of thousands south towards Paris, singing hymns as they marched. When they arrived, King Philip Augustus, a deeply pragmatic and unsentimental ruler, was not impressed. He consulted the scholars at the University of Paris, who wisely dismissed the whole affair, and the king ordered the crowd to disperse and go home. The French movement, faced with this firm royal command, largely dissolved. The second, larger, and far more tragic movement began in the German Rhineland, led by a boy named Nicholas of Cologne. Nicholas preached a simple and powerful message. He would lead his followers to the sea, which would part for them as the Red Sea had for Moses, and they would walk on dry land all the way to the Holy Land. There, he promised, they would peacefully convert the Muslims to Christianity. He gathered a colossal following, perhaps as many as 30,000 people, and led them on a long and agonizing march south. They had no supplies and no real plan, only a fervent belief that God would provide. The journey over the Alps was a catastrophe. Thousands died of starvation and exhaustion in the freezing mountain passes. The ragged survivors who followed Nicholas eventually reached the port city of Genoa in Italy. There, before a great crowd, Nicholas stood at the water's edge and prayed for the promised miracle. The sea stubbornly did not part. For many of his followers, this was the final disillusionment, and they abandoned the march. The city of Genoa, in a gesture of pity, offered citizenship to those who wished to stay and build a new life. Nicholas, his faith unshaken, led the remnant of his flock onward to the city of Pisa, where the miracle again failed to materialize. From there, he marched them to Rome itself. Pope Innocent III, the same powerful pontiff who had launched the Fourth Crusade, met with the ragged band. He was reportedly moved by their piety, but he understood the hopelessness of their cause. He gently praised their zeal, but formally released them from their crusading vows and commanded them to return to their homes. For most, the journey back over the Alps was even more deadly than the one coming down. Only a tiny fraction of the thousands who had set out from the Rhineland ever saw their homes again. A darker, though likely embellished legend tells of a splinter group of several thousand children who were tricked by two merchants in Pisa. They were offered free passage to the Holy Land, but were instead shipped to North Africa and sold into slavery. Whatever the precise details, the Children's Crusade was a disaster, a testament to the profound and desperate faith of the common people, and a tragic footnote in the story of the Holy Wars. The moral and political catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade had left the official crusading movement in tatters, but the dream of retaking Jerusalem refused to die. Pope Innocent III, though deeply angered by the diversion to Constantinople, was a man of indomitable will. He considered the recovery of the Holy Land to be the single most important objective of his papacy, and he was determined to launch one last great expedition, one that would be so meticulously planned and centrally controlled that it could not possibly go astray like its predecessor. At the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, one of the most important church councils of the entire Middle Ages, he unveiled his master plan. This was to be the most organized crusade in history. A universal peace was declared across Christendom for 4 years. A new tax was levied on all clergy to fund the expedition, and a clear and sophisticated military strategy was laid out. The target, once again, was to be Egypt. The call was answered not by the great kings, but by a broad coalition of powerful dukes and counts from across Europe, primarily from Austria, Hungary, and the German Empire. The first contingent, led by King Andrew II of Hungary, arrived in the Holy Land in 1217 and conducted a few indecisive raids in Galilee before King Andrew, having fulfilled his vow, promptly went home. The real campaign began in the spring of 1218, when a new combined army of Germans, Frisians, and the Knights of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the military orders landed at the mouth of the Nile in Egypt. Their target was the great port city of Damietta, the heavily fortified gateway to Cairo and the riches of Egypt. The siege of Damietta was a long, brutal, and technically demanding affair. The city's primary defense was a massive iron chain that stretched across the river to a formidable fortress in the middle of the Nile, known as the Chain Tower. As long as this tower held, the Crusader fleet could not attack the city's weaker river walls. For months, the Crusaders threw themselves at the tower with little success. Finally, a German scholastic and crusader named Oliver of Paderborn devised a brilliant solution. He lashed two large ships together and built a tall wooden siege tower on top of them. In a dramatic battle in August of 1218, this floating fortress was brought alongside the chain tower, and after a day of ferocious fighting, the Crusaders managed to storm the battlements and capture it. It was a major victory that allowed their fleet to break the chain and tighten the blockade of the city. The siege then bogged down into a grueling war of attrition. As the months wore on, the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, who was Saladin's nephew, found himself in a desperate position. He was facing a potential coup from his own emirs and was willing to do almost anything to get the Crusader army out of his country. He sent an envoy to the Crusader camp with one of the most astonishing peace offers in the history of the Holy Wars. In exchange for the Crusaders abandoning the siege and leaving Egypt, he offered to return the city of Jerusalem to them, along with all the territory of the former kingdom west of the Jordan River, and even the lost relic of the true cross. It was, in a single stroke, the complete fulfillment of every goal the crusading movement had held for a century, won not by fighting, but by diplomacy. The secular leaders in the camp, including the King of Jerusalem, John of Brienne, were overjoyed and strongly urged that the offer be accepted. But a new figure had arrived in the camp, who now held ultimate authority. The papal legate, Cardinal Pelagius of Albano. Pelagius was an arrogant, inflexible, and deeply pious man who was utterly convinced that God intended for the Crusaders to achieve a total military victory. He believed that any treaty made with non-believers was a sin, and that accepting the Sultan's offer would be a betrayal of God's will. He was certain that the total conquest of Egypt was within their grasp. Against the strenuous objections of the military commanders, Pelagius refused the Sultan's offer. His decision was a catastrophic blunder. The siege dragged on. The garrison and people of Damietta were slowly annihilated by famine and in disease. When the Crusaders finally breached the walls in November of 1219, after a siege of a year and a half, they found a city of the dead with only a few thousand survivors left out of a population of nearly 80,000. The victors then spent another 20 months occupying the captured city, squabbling over the division of the spoils, and waiting for the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, who had promised to join them with a massive army but kept making excuses. Finally, in the summer of 1221, Cardinal Pelagius, his patience exhausted, made another fateful decision. Against the frantic advice of King John and the other barons, he ordered the entire army to march south and capture Cairo itself. Historians debate whether this was an act of pure religious arrogance or a desperate gamble to force a victory. Whatever the motive, it was suicidal. It was the season of the annual Nile flood. Al-Kamil's army simply had to open the sluice gates, and the rising waters of the river quickly surrounded the Crusader army, trapping them on a narrow spit of land. Cut off, starving, and stranded in a sea of mud, The Great Crusade was utterly defeated without a single battle. To save their lives, they were forced to negotiate a humiliating surrender. The price of their freedom was the return of Damietta. The Fifth Crusade ended in an abject failure, having managed to snatch a historic defeat from the jaws of a seemingly certain and spectacular victory. The abject failure of the Fifth Crusade was a source of deep humiliation for the Church, and the blame was laid squarely on two figures: the arrogant papal legate, Pelagius, and the man who had promised to lead the crusade, but had never shown up, the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. Frederick was one of the most extraordinary and controversial figures of the entire Middle Ages. He was the king of Germany and Sicily, and through his marriage to the young Queen of Jerusalem, he was now its king as well. But he was no ordinary medieval monarch. Raised in the cosmopolitan, multicultural court of Sicily, he was a brilliant intellectual who spoke 6 languages, including Arabic, wrote poetry, and was a passionate patron of science and philosophy. He was also a deeply skeptical and pragmatic ruler who viewed the world through the lens of political reality, not religious dogma. His contemporaries, in a mixture of awe and suspicion, called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. Frederick had a long and poisonous relationship with the papacy, which saw his growing power in Italy as a direct threat. He had taken the crusading vow years before, but had repeatedly found political excuses to delay his departure. The new pope, Gregory VII, a stern and unyielding man, finally lost all patience. In 1227, when Frederick's fleet was forced to turn back due to a genuine outbreak of disease, the Pope refused to believe him and promptly excommunicated the most powerful monarch in Christendom. And so, it was under these bizarre and unprecedented circumstances that the Sixth Crusade began. In 1288, Frederick II, the excommunicated emperor, an official enemy of the Church, finally sailed to the Holy Land to lead a holy war. His arrival was met with confusion and hostility. The Pope had sent letters ahead forbidding any Christian from obeying or cooperating with the excommunicated emperor. This placed the military orders and the local barons in an impossible position. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers, whose first loyalty was to the Pope, officially refused to place themselves under Frederick's command. The local barons, who resented this foreign king who had never set foot in their kingdom, offered only lukewarm support. Frederick was an emperor with a very small army and almost no local allies. Militarily, his position was incredibly weak, but he held a powerful diplomatic advantage. The Ayyubid Empire, which had been so united under Saladin, was once again riven by internal conflict. The current Sultan of Egypt, the same Al-Kamil who had defeated the Fifth Crusade, was now locked in a bitter power struggle with his own brother, the ruler of Damascus. Al-Kamil saw Frederick's arrival not as a military threat, but as a political opportunity. He needed to neutralize the Crusaders on his western flank so he could focus on the civil war in Syria. He and Frederick, two of the most sophisticated and pragmatic rulers of their age, had long been in communication, exchanging letters and gifts, and sharing a mutual intellectual respect. Instead of preparing for battle, they began a remarkable series of negotiations. Frederick, despite the weakness of his actual army, negotiated with a magnificent bluff, using his grand imperial title and his fearsome reputation to create the illusion of overwhelming strength. In February of 1229, after months of intricate diplomacy, the two leaders signed the Treaty of Jaffa, a document that achieved through ink what a century of warfare had failed to do. The terms were astounding. Al-Kamil agreed to hand over the city of Jerusalem to the Christians, along with a corridor of land connecting it to the port of Jaffa. The holy cities of Bethlehem and Nazareth were also to be returned. Frederick II had won back Jerusalem without a single drop of blood being shed. It was, on the surface, the most successful crusade since the first. The reality, however, was far more complex, and the victory was met not with joyous celebration, but with widespread fury from both Christians and Muslims. For the Christian world, the treaty was a source of deep scandal. Frederick, an excommunicate, had made a deal with the infidel instead of conquering them in a righteous, bloody victory. The treaty itself was seen as a shameful compromise. It stipulated that the Temple Mount, with its sacred mosques, would remain under Muslim control, and that the city's walls were not to be rebuilt, leaving it permanently defenseless. The Pope was outraged. The Patriarch of Jerusalem immediately placed the newly recovered city under an interdict, a decree forbidding any and all Christian services from being held within its walls. When Frederick entered the city to claim his crown, he marched into a silent, hostile capital. He proceeded to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and with no priest willing to defy the interdict and perform a coronation, the Holy Roman Emperor had to lift the crown from the altar and place it upon his own head. The Templars and Hospitallers were particularly incensed, viewing the defenseless city as a strategic liability, not a prize. Many in the Muslim world were equally horrified, accusing Al-Kamil of betraying Islam by surrendering the holy city without a fight. The Sixth Crusade was a paradox, a brilliant diplomatic triumph that was a catastrophic public relations failure. Frederick, the triumphant king of Jerusalem, was soon forced to leave his new kingdom, which had made it abundantly clear it did not want him as its king. He had succeeded where all others had failed, but his victory had satisfied no one. Jerusalem was Christian once more, but it was a hollow crown, a defenseless city held by a controversial truce, a prize won by a man who was an enemy of the very church he was supposed to be serving. Frederick II's controversial treaty had secured Jerusalem, but it was a city held by a thread. Left without walls and governed by an absentee emperor who was despised by the local nobility, the new kingdom of Jerusalem was a fragile, hollow entity. The 10-year truce signed in 1229 was a ticking clock, and as it neared its expiration, a new, lesser-known crusading expedition set out from Europe to defend the gains that had been so strangely won. This was the Barons' Crusade, a series of campaigns led not by great kings, but by the powerful nobility of France and England. The first to arrive, in 1239, was a force led by Thibaut of Champagne, a famous poet king. His crusade was a military fiasco. He rashly marched his army towards Gaza, was drawn into an ambush by the Egyptians, and his forces were soundly defeated. He achieved nothing and sailed for home in disgrace. The second wave of the crusade, however, proved to be far more successful, precisely because it was led by a man who preferred the negotiating table to the battlefield. In 1240, Richard of Cornwall, the brother of the King of England and one of the wealthiest men in Europe, arrived in the Holy Land. Richard was a shrewd and pragmatic diplomat, and he arrived at another moment of perfect opportunity. The Ayyubid Empire was once again at war with itself, with the Sultan of Egypt locked in a bitter struggle against his uncle, the ruler of Damascus. Both Muslim rulers were desperate for a Frankish alliance to tip the balance in their favor. Richard of Cornwall played the situation with masterful skill, negotiating with both sides and playing them off against each other. Without fighting a single major battle, he secured a new treaty that was even more favorable than Frederick's. The Sultan of Egypt not only reaffirmed the handover of Jerusalem, but also returned a huge swath of territory in the Galilee and the vital fortress of Ascalon. The mainstream historical fact is that the Barons' Crusade, particularly Richard's diplomatic phase, was one of the most successful since the first, restoring the Kingdom of Jerusalem to its largest size since before the Battle of Hattin. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed a new golden age for Outremer was dawning. The Franks immediately set about refortifying their recovered lands, especially the great castle at Ascalon, and even began the monumental task of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem itself. But this false dawn was immediately squandered by the Franks' own suicidal internal politics. The local barons and the military orders, free from an immediate external threat, descended into a bitter civil war. The rivalry between the Templars and the Hospitallers exploded into open conflict, and the nobility split into factions. Their political maneuvering became so cynical and detached from any sense of a common Christian cause that they made formal military alliances with the rival Muslim princes. The Knights Templar, along with a faction of the local barons, allied themselves with their old enemy, the Ayyubid ruler of Damascus. In response, the Knights Hospitallers and the main body of the kingdom allied themselves with the Sultan of Egypt. Christian knights were now officially pledged to fight alongside Muslim armies against other Christian knights and their Muslim allies. The original crusading ideal was dead, replaced by a naked and treacherous game of power politics. It was the Sultan of Egypt who made the next catastrophic move. Seeking a decisive edge in his war against his Syrian relatives and their Templar allies, he unleashed a new and terrifying force upon the region. The great Khwarezmian Empire in Persia and Central Asia had recently been annihilated by the first wave of the Mongol invasions. Now, tens of thousands of their ferocious and desperate cavalry, driven from their homelands, roamed the Middle East as a vast army of mercenaries for hire. The Sultan invited a force of 10,000 of these Khwarezmian horsemen to sweep down from the north and invade Palestine. He had summoned a demon he could not control. In the summer of 1244, the Khwarezmians fell upon the Holy Land like a natural disaster. As they were not bound by any of the local codes of conduct, they were a force of pure, indiscriminate destruction. Their primary target was the still unwalled and defenseless city of Jerusalem. The sack that followed was the final, brutal end for Christian Jerusalem. The Khwarezmians slaughtered the city's inhabitants, massacring priests at their altars and nuns in their convents. They desecrated the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, even breaking open the tombs of the great kings of Jerusalem including Godfrey of Bouillon, and scattering their bones. The city was left a depopulated, smoking ruin. Jerusalem, which had been so strangely recovered, was now lost for the last and final time. In response to this horror, the feuding Frankish and Muslim allies of Syria put aside their differences and formed a combined army to confront the Egyptian Khwarezmian threat. In October of 1244, the two forces met near a small village called La Fourbi, close to Gaza. The battle was a catastrophe on the scale of Hattin. The Frankish-Syrian army was utterly annihilated. The military power of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was for the second time in its history wiped out in a single afternoon. The dream was over. All that was left was a handful of besieged coastal cities, awaiting their inevitable end. The news of the final, bloody loss of Jerusalem and the subsequent annihilation of the Frankish army at the Battle of La Fourbi was met in Europe with a kind of weary resignation. The crusading movement, which had once been a fire that swept the continent, was now a dying ember. The great kings and emperors were consumed with their own internal politics, and the immense cost in blood and treasure of these distant wars no longer seemed justifiable. But the ideal was not yet entirely dead. It lived on with a pure and unwavering intensity in the heart of one man, King Louis IX of France. Louis was a figure from another age, a king whose personal piety and moral conviction were so profound that he would later be canonized as Saint Louis. In an era of increasingly cynical and pragmatic rulers, Louis was a true believer. He saw himself as a servant of God, and he was driven by a deep, personal responsibility to restore Christ's patrimony in the Holy Land. In 1244, after making a recovery from a near-fatal illness that he attributed to divine intervention, he took the crusading vow. He then spent the next 4 years in the most meticulous and expensive preparations for a crusade that had ever been undertaken. It was to be an exclusively French affair, a national effort on a colossal scale. He even ordered the construction of a new, purpose-built port on the Mediterranean coast of France at Aigues-Mortes, from which his great fleet would sail. His strategy was the one that had become orthodox. He would attack Egypt, the heart of Ayyubid power. The Seventh Crusade set sail in 1248. In the spring of 1249, the French fleet, a forest of masts bearing the fleur-de-lis, arrived off the coast of Damietta. The initial landing was a spectacular success. King Louis, a tall and commanding figure, was one of the first men ashore, wading through the chest-deep surf, holding the sacred royal banner, the oriflamme, and leading his knights onto the beach. The sight of the French king leading the charge so terrified the Egyptian garrison that they, remembering the long and horrific siege of the Fifth Crusade, panicked and abandoned the city almost without a fight. Damietta, the great prize that had cost the previous crusade a 1.5 years of suffering, fell in a single day. The victory seemed so easy that it was hailed as a miracle, a clear sign of God's favor. But this triumphant beginning, just as in the Fifth Crusade, was followed by a long and fatal delay. The army was forced to wait in Damietta for 6 months for the annual Nile flood to recede. During this time, the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt died, and the political situation was thrown into chaos. A new and far more ruthless power began to assert itself from within the Egyptian army. The Mamluks, an elite corps of Turkish slave soldiers. When the French army finally began its advance towards Cairo in late 1249, they were met by this newly energized force. Near the town of Mansoura, the crusade met its doom. The king's impetuous brother, Robert of Artois, leading the vanguard, found an unguarded river crossing, and against the king's explicit orders, launched a reckless charge directly into the town. He and his entire force, including the Grand Master of the Templars and many of the best knights, were trapped in the narrow streets and annihilated. The main army, arriving later, was drawn into a brutal battle where they managed to hold their ground but suffered horrific casualties. They were now trapped, their supply lines cut, and a terrible epidemic of scurvy and dysentery began to sweep through their camp. The once mighty army was forced into a disastrous retreat, and the Mamluks surrounded them. King Louis himself, so ill with dysentery that he could barely stand, was captured, along with the entire surviving French army. It was a humiliation on a scale that Christendom had never before seen. Louis was eventually released after a massive ransom was paid, and he agrees to return the city of Damietta. His first great crusade had ended in utter catastrophe. Louis, however, was a man of unshakable faith. He spent 4 years in the Holy Land after his release, using his own funds to refortify the remaining Christian cities before returning to France. But the dream of liberating Jerusalem never left him. 16 years later, in 1270, now an old and frail man, he launched his second and final expedition, the Eighth Crusade. In a strange and still debated strategic move, he directed his fleet not to Egypt or Syria, but to Tunis, on the coast of North Africa. Historians still argue about this bizarre choice. Was he misled by his brother, Charles of Anjou, who had his own political ambitions in the region? Or did he genuinely believe he could convert the emir of Tunis to Christianity? Whatever the reason, it was a fatal one. The army landed near the ruins of ancient Carthage in the blistering heat of the Tunisian summer. Disease, likely typhus, immediately swept through the unsanitary camp. On August 25th, 1270, King Louis IX, the last of the great crusaders, died of the pestilence in his tent, his final whispered word reportedly being Jerusalem. His death marked the end of an era. The age of the grand, royal-led Crusades was well and truly over. The death of St. Louis on the shores of Tunis in 1270 was more than just the end of a single campaign. It was the death of the classical crusading movement itself. For a century and a half, the beleaguered Frankish states of Outremer had been sustained by these great, periodic infusions of manpower and enthusiasm from the West. Now it was becoming painfully clear that no more great royal armies would be coming to their rescue. The small, squabbling Christian enclaves clinging to the Syrian coast were for the first time truly on their own, and they were facing a new and terrifyingly efficient enemy. The Ayyubid dynasty, founded by Saladin, had been swept away in a tide of its own making. The real power in Egypt was now in the hands of the Mamluks. The Mamluk system was a unique and formidable military institution. For generations, the sultans of Egypt had built their elite army corps from slave boys, mostly of Kipchak Turkic origin, purchased from the great slave markets of the Eurasian steppe. These boys were brought to Cairo, converted to Islam, and raised in isolated barracks in a life of intense and unceasing military training. They were a professional warrior caste, with no family ties or local loyalties, devoted solely to their military brotherhood and to the sultan who owned them. They were, quite simply, the most disciplined and effective soldiers in the entire Islamic world. In 1250, during the chaos that followed the defeat of Louis IX's crusade, the Mamluk emirs, realizing their own strength, murdered the last Ayyubid sultan and seized power for themselves, establishing a new, aggressive, and ruthlessly pragmatic Mamluk sultanate. The figure who would come to embody this new power was a man named Baybars al-Bundukdari, a former slave with piercing blue eyes. Baybars was a brilliant and brutal general who had risen through the ranks. He played a key role in the defeat of St. Louis at Mansoura, and a decade later, in 1260, he co-commanded the Mamluk army that achieved the seemingly impossible. At the Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, the Mamluks inflicted the first ever major defeat on the Mongols, halting their seemingly unstoppable westward advance and saving the Islamic heartlands from destruction. This victory made the Mamluks the undisputed champions of Islam. Soon after, Baybars assassinated the reigning sultan and took the throne for himself. As sultan, Baybars was the anti-Saladin. He possessed none of Saladin's chivalrous mercy or diplomatic subtlety. He was a creature of pure, unsentimental warfare, and he viewed the remaining Frankish states not as rivals to be negotiated with, but as a foreign infection to be methodically and permanently eradicated. With the Mongol threat contained, Baybars unleashed the full, terrifying might of the Mamluk war machine against the remnants of Outremer. His was not a war of raids and skirmishes, but a slow, deliberate, and systematic campaign of annihilation, a year-by-year strangulation of the Christian coastal cities. He was a master of siegecraft, employing colossal siege engines that could reduce the strongest walls to rubble, and he practiced a scorched earth policy of unprecedented thoroughness. The mainstream historical fact is that Baybars's core strategy was to ensure that no future crusade could ever gain a foothold. When he captured a Frankish port city, he didn't just occupy it. He systematically demolished its walls, its citadel, and its harbor, rendering it useless as a future military base. One by one, the legendary names of the Crusader kingdom began to fall. In 1265, he captured the cities of Caesarea and Arsuf, both of which were razed to the ground. In 1266, he took the great Templar fortress of Saft in the Galilee, one of the strongest castles in the world. After the garrison surrendered under a promise of safe conduct, Baybars had the treaty nullified on a technicality and had the entire Templar garrison of 2,000 men beheaded. In 1268 came the most devastating blow of all, the fall of the great city of Antioch. The ancient principality, the second of the original Crusader states, was extinguished in a horrific sack and massacre that shocked both East and West. Even the seemingly impregnable Croix des Chevaliers, the masterpiece of the Knights Hospitaller, fell to Baybars in 1271, taken by a combination of siege and trickery when he had a forged letter delivered to the garrison ordering them to surrender. The Franks sent desperate appeals for help to the west, but the response was minimal. A small crusade led by Prince Edward of England, the future King Edward III, arrived in 1271. While Edward was a skilled commander, His army was far too small to challenge Baybars directly, and he accomplished little beyond securing a temporary truce. By the time of Baybars's death in 1277, the once proud kingdom of Outremer had been reduced to two cities, Tripoli and Acre, and a handful of isolated castles, all living on borrowed time, hopelessly divided by their own petty internal feuds, awaiting the final, inevitable blow. The death of Sultan Baybars in 1277 granted the last, shattered remnants of the Crusader states a brief and deceptive respite. The new Mamluk Sultan, Qalawun, was initially occupied with internal matters, allowing the Franks a little over a decade of borrowed time. But the Christian cities of Outremer used this peace not to unify and prepare, but to descend into a final, suicidal spasm of internal feuding. The last capital of the kingdom, the port city of Acre, was a microcosm of this decay. It was a city of immense wealth, a bustling hub of international trade, but it was not a unified state. It was a chaotic patchwork of fortified competing commercial and military districts, each a law unto itself. The Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitallers were in a state of open rivalry. The merchant communes of Venice and Genoa waged their own private naval wars in the city's harbor, and the authority of the titular King of Jerusalem, who now also ruled from the island of Cyprus, was almost non-existent. The end was triggered by an act of senseless violence. In the summer of 1290, a group of newly arrived, undisciplined Italian crusaders rioted in the streets of Acre, and in a fit of misplaced zeal, massacred a number of peaceful Muslim merchants. Sultan Qalawun, who had been looking for a pretext to break the existing truce, demanded that the city hand over the perpetrators for justice. The city's fractious ruling council, unable to reach a consensus, refused. Qalawun began preparing for a final war, but died before he could launch it. His son and successor, Al-Ashraf Khalil, however, inherited his father's vow to wipe the last Frankish city from the map. In the spring of 1291, he marched out of Cairo with the largest and most sophisticated siege army the Mamluk Sultanate had ever produced. In early April, the defenders of Acre looked out from their battlements at a terrifying and awe-inspiring spectacle. The plain before the city was covered by the tents of the Mamluk host, an army of over 100,000 men, and with them they had brought a truly colossal siege train, nearly 100 massive stone-throwing catapults, or trebuchets, some so large they had to be transported in pieces and assembled on site. The defense of the city was heroic. Faced with their own extinction, the feuding factions of Acre finally united. The Templars, Hospitallers, and the new German Order of the Teutonic Knights took command of the city's famed double walls, their ranks bolstered by a few thousand professional soldiers and the able-bodied men of the city. For 6 weeks, they held out against the overwhelming Mamluk assault. The bombardment was relentless. Day and night, the great Mamluk engines hurled 1,000-pound stones against the walls, methodically reducing the proud towers and ancient ramparts to rubble. The air was filled with the constant crash of stone, the splintering of timber, and the sound of trumpets and war drums from the Mamluk camp. The Franks launched a series of desperate nighttime raids, sallying out from the gates to try and burn the enemy's siege machines, but they were always driven back with terrible losses. Mamluk miners, protected by huge wooden shields, worked tirelessly at the base of the walls, digging tunnels to collapse the foundations of the main towers. The final assault came before dawn on the 18th of May, after a devastatingly all-night bombardment had created several major breaches in the outer wall. The Mamluk army charged forward with a deafening roar. The fighting in the breaches was savage, a desperate, hand-to-hand struggle amidst the dust and rubble. The Grand Master of the Temple, Guillaume de Beaujeu, was mortally wounded as he rallied his knights, a devastating blow to the defenders' morale. The Mamluks poured through the breaches, and the city's organized defense collapsed into a chaotic street-by-street fight for survival. What followed was a horrific massacre. The Mamluk army, given free rein, rampaged through the city, slaughtering tens of thousands. Many of the inhabitants fled to the harbor hoping to escape by sea, but in the panic, their overloaded boats capsized and thousands drowned. The last stand was made in the Templars' own headquarters, a massive, fortified compound that projected into the sea like a fortress within a fortress. Here, the last of the warrior monks and thousands of civilians who had sought refuge within its walls held out for 10 more days. Finally, the Mamluk miners succeeded in collapsing one of the main towers. The mainstream historical fact is that the Great Tower fell with a thunderous crash, killing the last of its defenders, but also crushing a large number of the elite Mamluk soldiers who were swarming into the breach below, a final, mutual act of destruction. A handful of knights, including the future Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay, managed to escape by boat to Cyprus. After the fall of Acre, the few remaining Christian cities on the mainland surrendered without a fight. The Mamluks, true to Baybars's policy, systematically demolished every one of them, leaving the coast a barren ruin. The nearly 200-year story of Outremer, the Crusader kingdom beyond the sea, was over. Even as the last Christian strongholds in the Holy Land were crumbling, the institution of the Crusade was not dying. Instead, it was evolving, its focus shifting from the distant sands of Palestine to the fields and forests of Europe itself. The powerful spiritual and legal machinery that the papacy had developed over the previous century to motivate holy war was too potent a tool to be abandoned. If the enemies of Christ could be fought in Jerusalem, they could also be fought closer to home. And in the early 13th century, the Church came to believe that its most dangerous enemy was not a foreign sultan, but a heresy that was flourishing in the very heart of Christendom. The region of Languedoc in southern France was, at this time, one of the most culturally vibrant and sophisticated societies in Europe. It was the land of the troubadours, of courtly love, and of a powerful nobility that enjoyed a high degree of independence from the French king in the north. It was also the home of a popular and rapidly growing religious movement known as Catharism. The Cathars were Christians, but their beliefs were so radically different from the Catholic Church that they were in essence a separate religion. They were dualists, meaning they believed that the universe was a battleground between two opposing gods, a good God who had created the world of the spirit, and an evil God, or Satan, who had trapped those spirits in the corrupt, material world he had created. From this core belief flowed a series of heresies that struck at the very foundation of Catholicism. Since the material world was evil, The Cathars rejected the Old Testament and its wrathful creator God. They believed that Christ was a pure spirit and could not have had a physical, human body, thus denying the incarnation and the resurrection. They rejected the sacraments, especially the Eucharist, as meaningless rituals involving corrupt material things like water and bread, and they viewed the wealthy, powerful, and land-owning Roman Catholic Church as a fraudulent institution, a creation of the evil God designed to enslave humanity. Their own church was a simple, ascetic structure led by an elite group of men and women known as the Perfects, who lived lives of extreme poverty and chastity. This simple, anti-materialist faith was enormously popular among both the peasants and the nobles of the Languedoc. For decades, the papacy tried to root out this heresy through peaceful means, sending preachers like the future Saint Dominic to debate the Cathars in public. But these efforts were a total failure. The final straw for the great Pope Innocent III was the murder of his papal legate, or ambassador, in the region in 1208. The Pope blamed the most powerful lord of the Languedoc, Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, for the crime. The next year, Innocent called for a crusade. He offered the knights of Europe, particularly the pious and land-hungry barons of northern France, the exact same spiritual reward, the complete remission of all sins, for fighting the Christian heretics in the Languedoc, as he did for fighting the Muslims in the Holy Land. The Albigensian Crusade, named after the town of Albi, a major Cathar center, was a brutal 20-year conflict that pitted the grim, feudal culture of the North against the tolerant, sophisticated society of the South. The war began in 1209 with an act of shocking brutality that would set the tone for the entire conflict. When the crusading army, led by a northern baron named Simon de Montfort, took the city of Béziers, they were faced with the problem of how to distinguish the faithful Catholics from the heretics inside. The papal legate in command, a Cistercian abbot, was asked for guidance. His supposed reply has become one of the most infamous phrases of the Middle Ages. Historians still debate the quote's authenticity, but he is reported to have said, "Kill them all, for the Lord knows those who are his." Whether he actually said it or not, the army proceeded to do exactly that, slaughtering the city's entire population of nearly 20,000 people in a single afternoon. The war that followed was a savage series of sieges and massacres. Cathar perfects, when captured, refused to recant their faith and were often burned at the stake en masse. The Crusade was both a religious war and a war of conquest, as Simon de Montfort and the other northern lords systematically stripped the southern nobility of their lands. By the time the fighting ended in 1229, the vibrant, independent culture of the Languedoc had been crushed, and the entire region was eventually absorbed into the Kingdom of France. The Cathar faith itself, though driven underground, was not yet extinguished. To finish the job, the Church created a new and terrifyingly efficient institution, the medieval Inquisition, which would spend the next century hunting down the last remnants of the heresy with a systematic and relentless legal process, ensuring its final and total eradication. The crusading sword had been successfully turned inward, setting a dangerous and powerful precedent for the future. While the great drama of the Holy War was reaching its tragic conclusion in the Levant, The powerful and adaptable institution of the Crusade was thriving in another, very different theater of operations, the vast, dark, and cold frontier of northeastern Europe. The Albigensian Crusade had proven that the spiritual rewards and legal framework of a holy war could be effectively turned against enemies within Christendom. The Northern Crusades would prove that the same model could be used to fuel a brutal, centuries-long war of colonial expansion and forced conversion against Europe's last remaining pagans. The frontier was the swampy, densely forested landscape bordering the Baltic Sea, the home of a host of tribal peoples, the Wends, the Prussians, the Livonians, and the Lithuanians, who had for centuries resisted the advance of Christianity, fiercely guarding their ancient traditions and their sacred groves. The conflict in this region began as a conventional border war, a long history of raids and counter-raids between the German and Danish Christian kingdoms and their pagan neighbors. But in 1147, at the same time as the Second Crusade was setting off for the Holy Land, the great preacher Bernard of Clairvaux gave his blessing to a parallel crusade against the Slavic Wends, living east of the Elbe River. He offered the German nobles a stark and chilling choice for their pagan foes: baptism or annihilation. This act officially rebranded a regional war of expansion as a holy war, giving the German and Danish princes a powerful religious justification for conquest. For the next century, these crusades were a messy and often inconclusive affair, a series of summer campaigns that would conquer a territory 1 year only to see it rebel and return to paganism the next. The real turning point came with the arrival of the military orders, who brought a level of discipline, organization, and relentless, fanatical purpose that the secular lords lacked. The first was the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, a German order founded in 1202 to conquer and convert the peoples of modern-day Latvia and Estonia. But the most significant and formidable of these orders was the Teutonic Knights, originally founded as a small charitable brotherhood to care for German pilgrims during the siege of Acre in the Third Crusade. The Teutonic Order was a latecomer, overshadowed by the massive power of the Templars and Hospitallers. Their astute Grand Master, a man named Hermann von Salza, a brilliant diplomat and a close friend of Emperor Frederick II, realized that the Order's future lay not in the dying kingdom of Jerusalem, but in the new frontiers of Europe. His opportunity came in 1226, when a Polish duke, Conrad of Mazovia, invited the Teutonic Knights to his lands to help him subdue the pagan Prussian tribes who were relentlessly raiding his territory. Hermann von Salza negotiated a brilliant deal. He secured a papal bull and an imperial charter that granted the Teutonic Order absolute sovereign authority over any and all lands they conquered from the Prussians. They were not fighting as vassals to a king. They were embarking on the creation of their very own state. The Prussian Crusade was a slow, methodical, and incredibly brutal war of conquest that lasted for more than 50 years. The Knights' strategy was based on a relentless forward advance, secured by the building of castles. They would push into pagan territory, erect a simple timber and earth fort, and hold it against ferocious local counterattacks. Once the surrounding area was pacified, this fort would be used as a base for the next advance, and it would later be rebuilt in the iconic red brick of the Order's architectural style. The conquest was followed by colonization. The knights invited thousands of German peasants, merchants, and priests to settle the newly conquered lands, fundamentally and permanently changing the demographic and cultural landscape of the region. By the late 13th century, after absorbing the remnants of the Livonian sword brothers, the Teutonic Knights had succeeded in conquering all of Prussia and what is now Latvia and Estonia. They had created something unique in history, the Ordensstaat, a sovereign theocratic state ruled by a monastic order of warrior monks. It was a highly efficient, centralized, and perpetually militarized society whose primary reason for being was the continuation of the Holy War against the last great pagan power in Europe, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Historians still debate whether the Northern Crusades were primarily a pious missionary enterprise aimed at saving souls, or a brutal, land-grabbing campaign of colonial conquest that was simply cloaked in the convenient language of a holy war. In either case, the results were undeniable. In stark contrast to the failures in the Holy Land, the Northern Crusades were a spectacular and lasting success. They brutally suppressed the last pagan cultures of Europe and decisively expanded the borders of Western Christendom, creating a powerful new German-speaking state on the Baltic that would shape the politics of the region for centuries to come. The crusading ideal, born in the heat of Syria, had found its most permanent home in the cold forests of the north. By the dawn of the 14th century, the original crusading dream was dead, buried in the rubble of Acre. While the holy war of the Teutonic Knights continued its grinding progress in the cold Baltic forests, the great pan-European expeditions to the east were over. For 200 years, they had been the central project of Christendom, a powerful engine that had mobilized the wealth and manpower of a continent. Now, that engine was sputtering to a halt. The decline of the crusading ideal was not a single event, but a slow and complex process, a fading away driven by a combination of military failure, political cynicism, and a profound change in the very structure of European society. The most obvious reason was failure. A century of costly and humiliating defeats, from the disasters of the Second Crusade to the capture of St. Louis and the final ignominious loss of the Holy Land, had taken a deep psychological toll. It became increasingly difficult to convince people that God willed a venture that He so consistently allowed to fail. Furthermore, the very concept of the crusade had been diluted and abused by the papacy itself. Popes in the 13th and 14th centuries began to use the crusading bull with its powerful spiritual incentives as a political weapon against their European enemies. Crusades were declared against the Holy Roman Emperors in Italy, against rebellious kings, and even against political rivals in Rome. When the sacred vow could be taken to fight a political squabble in Lombardy, it cheapened the value of the original cause. If everything was a crusade, then nothing was truly a crusade. Perhaps the most significant factor, however, was the changing face of Europe. The High Middle Ages, with its ideal of a universal, unified Christendom, was giving way to the rise of powerful, centralized nation-states, particularly in England and France. The loyalties of knights and nobles were shifting away from a transnational religious identity and towards a more national one, focused on the service of their king. These new kings, in turn, were far more interested in consolidating their own power and fighting their own national wars, like the burgeoning Hundred Years' War between England and France, than they were in pouring vast resources into distant papal expeditions. The world was becoming more secular, more political, and the simple unifying call of God wills it no longer held the power it once had. Despite this general decline, the 14th and 15th centuries did see several last, great gasps of the old crusading ideal. But these were no longer wars of conquest in the Levant. They were desperate defensive actions against a new and terrifying power that was threatening Europe from the east, the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans, a new and dynamic Turkish dynasty, had swept through the remnants of the Byzantine and Seljuk empires, crossed into the Balkans, and were now pushing into the heart of Christian Europe. In response, two major crusades were launched to halt their advance. The first was the Crusade of Nicopolis in 1396, a vast chivalric army of French, Hungarian, and German knights, brimming with aristocratic arrogance, marched down the Danube to confront the Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid the Thunderbolt. The campaign was a catastrophe. The French knights, refusing to listen to the more cautious advice of their Hungarian allies, launched a reckless and disorganized cavalry charge, and their entire army was annihilated. The second great effort was the Crusade of Varna in 1484, led by a Polish and Hungarian army. After some initial successes, it too ended in a crushing defeat at the Battle of Varna, where the Christian army was destroyed and its king was killed. The final symbolic death knell of the original crusading ideal sounded in 1453, when the last remnant of the Roman Empire, the great city of Constantinople, which had been fatally weakened by the Fourth Crusade 2 centuries earlier, fell to the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed the Conqueror. The Pope issued frantic calls for a great crusade to retake the city, but the kings of Europe, busy with their own affairs, offered only empty words and token gestures. No great army mustered, no great fleet set sail. The age was well and truly over. Historians debate the precise end of the Crusades. Some see the fall of Acre in 1291 as the definitive conclusion. Others point to the failed expeditions of the 15th century. A few argue that the ideal lived on with the Knights Hospitaller, who continued their holy war from the islands of Rhodes and then Malta well into the 16th century. But by any measure, the powerful, continent-spanning social and religious phenomenon that had begun in a field at Clermont had faded into history, replaced by a new world of nations, politics, and a very different understanding of the relationship between faith and war. The last Crusader ships sailed away from the smoking ruins of the Syrian coast, leaving behind them a story of 2 centuries of unimaginable faith, ambition, violence, and failure. What then, in the quiet light of history, was it all for? What was the final, lasting legacy of this immense and convulsive movement? In their primary stated goal, the permanent recovery of the Holy Land for Christendom, the Crusades were an unambiguous and spectacular failure. The kingdom they forged in blood was ultimately erased, and Jerusalem, the city that had launched 1,000 ships and 1,000,000 prayers, remained firmly under Muslim rule. Yet the impact of the Crusades radiated far beyond the battlefields of the Levant, reshaping the West, in ways the original participants could never have imagined. Politically, the consequences were a tapestry of contradictions. The Fourth Crusade's scandalous attack on Constantinople dealt a fatal blow to the Byzantine Empire, fatally weakening the ancient Christian bulwark in the east and arguably paving the way for its eventual conquest by the Ottoman Turks. For the papacy, the Crusades were at first a source of unprecedented prestige, allowing popes to direct the military might of Europe. But their later abuse of the crusading vow for purely political wars in Europe cheapened the ideal and ultimately undermined the very papal authority they had sought to enhance. For the kings of France and England, the massive financial requirements of crusading helped them to build the nascent machinery of national taxation and centralized government, contributing to the slow rise of the nation-states that would come to define the modern world. Economically, the Crusades were a powerful engine of change. The need to transport and supply vast armies across the sea spurred a revolution in shipbuilding and finance, and it turned the Italian maritime republics of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa into fabulously wealthy superpowers. The constant traffic between East and West opened up new and permanent trade routes, creating a lasting European appetite for the luxury goods of the Orient. Spices like pepper and cinnamon, exotic fabrics like silk and muslin, and a new and highly addictive substance called sugar. This hunger for the riches of the East would centuries later help to fuel the great age of discovery. The darkest and perhaps most enduring legacy of the Crusades was the profound and lasting animosity they created. The brutal massacres that accompanied the launch of the First Crusade introduced a new and vicious strain of anti-Semitism into European life, a poison that would linger for centuries. The sack of Constantinople created a wound between Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christianity that has in many ways never truly healed. And for the Islamic world, the memory of the Fronde, the violent invaders from the West, would be passed down through generations, becoming a powerful and resonant symbol of foreign aggression, a historical trauma whose echoes can still be heard in the complex geopolitics of the modern world. The Crusades were born from a collision of worlds, and they left behind a legacy of division, a deep and bitter memory of a time when the cross was fixed not to a church, but to a sword. And so, the great and terrible story of the Holy Wars, with all its sound and fury, finally settles into the quiet dust of the past. The impassioned cries of "God wills it" that once echoed across the fields of France have faded into a whisper on the wind. The magnificent armies, with their brilliant banners and their shining armor, have long since marched over the horizon of memory, their epic journeys now just faint traces on the map of time. The voices of the great figures, the popes and emperors, the sultans and the kings, grow distant, their fierce ambitions and their pious hopes now at rest. The clashing of swords at Antioch, the desperate prayers on the walls of Jerusalem, and the silent, grinding misery of the long marches have all dissolved into the deep and profound peace that only the passage of centuries can bring. The story is told. The great struggle is over. Let the clamor of the past now give way to the stillness of the present, as the last images of castles and kings softens at the edges, blurring into the gentle and welcoming darkness. All that is left now is the quiet, the calm, and the slow, steady drift towards your own peaceful rest.